When I found out I was going to be a parent, I immediately felt a lot of anxiety and worry. So I went on to BetterHelp to try to look for a therapist to help me with that.
My relationship with my family and with my boyfriend and with myself were suffering. I really needed help.
I was ruminating a lot. Really getting those thoughts out to a therapist and getting feedback was just life-changing.
Discover what BetterHelp Online Therapy can do for you. Visit BetterHelp.com today.
If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now everything's on sale during our Memorial Day event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses for a limited time. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number, to a good life sleep.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan.
And I am Claire Wells.
And this is our second episode together, Claire and I. A few episodes ago, we covered the doctors of Agatha Christie, and now we are back as promised to discuss the nurses of Agatha Christie. I am so thrilled to have Claire here again. And listeners, she really brought it with her research into nurses, so get ready. This is going to be quite the episode. I am just going to run through Claire's bio again briefly, but I will refer you to our doctors episode in which we chatted a bit more about Claire's love of Christie and went in a little more depth into her background. We won't repeat ourselves here too much because we have too much material to cover. So Claire Wells is from Worcestershire, England, and she now lives in Reno, Nevada, here in the United States. She is a longtime fan of the All About Agatha podcast and has been an avid reader of Agatha Christie since her early 20s when she picked up her first Christie novel on a transatlantic flight from the UK to the US, Five Little Pigs, no less, and immediately became hooked. I believe I made the really bad pun in our doctor's episode that you could say it was love in the clouds, but I'm going to improve that bad pun by amending it slightly because when I listened back to the episode, I saw a missed opportunity. Obviously, it was birth in the clouds, the birth of a Christie lover. And Claire is making good on that love in these two medical-themed episodes, in which she is bringing her personal history and work experience to bear on her Christie fandom. She works as a health and safety director, but she began her career in healthcare after qualifying as a physiotherapist, or physical therapist, as we would say in the United States, in the National Health Service, aka the NHS. She later spent 7 years in leadership roles across the UK care sector, working in settings ranging from hospitals to daycare centers. Coming from a family of nurses, she has long been interested in the evolution of healthcare in Britain. This interest makes Christie's medical characters especially fascinating to her, particularly the variety of medical characters in the canon and how major changes in 20th century healthcare are reflected in the novels. Claire, it is just beyond lovely to have you back.
Thank you so much, Kemper, and thank you for such a lovely introduction. And it is wonderful to be back. I'm so excited about this episode, so thank you for having me.
First, I just want to give a blanket spoiler warning, just as I did in our doctor's episode. We are covering so many different titles here and getting very in-depth and being very spoilery. So if you are worried about spoilers of novels, short stories, plays, anything, this is not the episode for you. Pause and come back to it later after you have read absolutely everything. Or just don't worry about the spoilers, because this episode's going to be a lot of fun. So we are releasing this episode right in the middle of International Nurses Week, which is held each year starting on the 6th of May and culminating on the 12th of May, which is International Nurses Day. And that day is celebrated in both the US and UK, which makes me happy. The reason that this day was chosen is that it is the birthday of one Florence Nightingale, who is truly the founder of modern nursing. Claire is going to tell us a little, just a little, about the Lady of the Lamp in a little bit, so I will leave it at that. And before we get into the nurses of Christie, I actually want to do a mini mailbag segment about the doctors of Agatha Christie, because on our earlier episode, we asked you, our dear listeners, to get in touch about any doctors we may have missed or misconstrued, and you did not disappoint. I knew that you wouldn't. Given how many doctors there are in Christie's canon, I actually think that Claire and I did pretty well here. But as I see it, there are 3 doctors we didn't mention, or didn't mention in the right way, who deserve a little shout out now. 1 mean and 2 nice. So I'll start with the mean one. This is an omission that actually occurred to me after the fact. So I guess this is me sending mail to myself. That always happens right after I click the button to release the episode. I'm like, oh no, I forgot about this person. And that would be Dr. Franklin from Curtin. He is one of our mean doctors of Christie. At least he is to me, because he has some horribly ableist views as to genetic superiority, which essentially amount to eugenics, which was a way of thinking that was much more prevalent when Christie was writing that book, which, as a reminder that most of you don't need, was probably 1940-ish, even though the book didn't come out until 1975. Dr. Franklin is also engaging in an affair with young Judith Hastings, much to the horror of Captain Hastings. He doesn't seem to be a particularly good husband to his wife, though she doesn't seem to be a particularly good wife to him either. I got a distinct John Christo vibe from him. He's a brilliant doctor who is good at his trade, but maybe not the best human. Claire, do you have any thoughts or comments on Dr. Franklin?
Yeah, I agree. Not the best bedside manner, although brilliant at what he's doing. I just think it's amazing. We talked for almost 3 hours last time and still missed some doctors. And actually researching for this episode and looking at the nurses, I saw more doctors and I just thought, wow, I can't believe we forgot them. So just thanks to how many there are in the canon.
It's the joy of Christie, right? There's always more. Just when you think you've got a handle on everything, you've got your arms around the whole thing. No. Something has slipped past you, but it's really fun. I had the exact same experience as I was doing this research. It was almost a little torturous because you were like tangential to the doctors, but we've already covered those. And I was like, oh, and that one, and that one, and that one. So let's talk about 2 major-ish doctors who we didn't, well, one of them got a very brief mention on our episode and the other one didn't get a mention at all. And these are both nice doctors. So I made a whole point about how there are these doctors who Poirot likes to pal around with, which is so different from the way Miss Marple tends to associate with doctors. I mentioned Dr. Stoddart, Dr. Hawker, Dr. McAndrew, and of course, Dr. Stillingfleet, who appears in 2 Poirot stories. But there was one doctor I did not mention who absolutely belongs in this list. And here I will turn to friend of the podcast, Dr. Michelle Casmer, who wrote in about this. Here's what she had to say. As I began listening to the wonderful Doctors episode with Claire Wells, I started mentally categorizing my favorite good guy doctors and was very excited to hear Doctors Stillingfleet, in both of his iterations, regardless of his inability to age, and Stoddart get some love. I always put those into the same little group in my mind. The saviors who all actually seem like they might be aware and appreciative of the true nature of the women they fall in love with during the stories, and not the bad kind of savior. I know you know what I mean. However, and you even brought up Sad Cypress because Stillingfleet is mentioned there, I fully expected as we got closer to the end that you were saving, see what I did there, Peter Lord for last because he's awesome. And yes, oh dear, how could we have forgotten sweet Dr. Lord from Sad Cypress, who is absolutely another one of these genial doctor friends of Poirot's, and he's a doctor lover as well. Though as Michelle points out, he doesn't use his position as a doctor to force himself on his patient, the very put upon Eleanor Carlisle. She's been through a lot. He has such humility at the end of the story that he doesn't even necessarily think that he is good enough for her or that she would ever even think of him in that way, which is definitely very different from the likes of Dr. Christo and Dr. Franklin and other such doctors. Dr. Lord even doctors evidence, a doctor who doctors, in an attempt to mislead Monsieur Poirot himself in the effort to protect Eleanor when the walls are closing in on her. He fails miserably in that attempt, of course. And the final lines of the book are devoted to Poirot convincing this humble doctor that he is the one who should end up with Eleanor and not the detestable Roderick Wellman. So I do think Dr. Lord really is a delightful character and deserves a mention. I have to imagine that you agree, Claire, although maybe you don't. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, I totally agree. I think, again, rereading that one for this episode and just realizing what a great doctor he is, I had the same thoughts. How did we forget him? He is awesome. So, yeah, very well deserved.
And a totally robust doctor character, you know, for as many doctors in Christie who really can be marginalized and just serve like one purpose, he's really a major character in that novel. So definitely worth mentioning. And in that vein, we actually have another nice doctor character who is not a friend of Poirot's, because he actually appears in a Miss Marple novel. And for this omission, I will read from another listener message that we got. Here goes. I just listened to the episode about the doctors in Agatha Christie, which was one of my favorites so far. Thank you very much for this. I wanted to make a few additions, if this is okay. First of all, Dr. Owen Griffith in The Moving Finger is far from just the random doctor who is there to make some medical examination and then is never to be seen. In fact, he may very well be the most major non-murderer or victim doctor in the Christie canon, except for Sarah King. You probably mixed him up with someone else. He has quite a major role in the novel. He is the brother of the girl guide Amy Griffith and has a romantic subplot with Joanna Burton. They end up with each other in the end, and so he's another doctor lover. Okay, let me just pause to note that on our Doctors episode, when I was running through my list of more minor doctor characters in the canon early in the episode, I was pulling names off of an Excel spreadsheet willy-nilly. And I got burned for that by including poor sweet Dr. Griffith from The Moving Finger in this list. That was totally an error on my part. I will blame the fact that The Moving Finger is not one of my favorite Christies. It's the rare Christie that I think I actually like a bit less than the average Christie fan. So that is my reason for why. That's my excuse for why he wasn't top of mind. But you are absolutely right, listener. Okay, back to this message. And speaking of Dr. Lovers, there's also, in a pretty major role, Dr. Peter Lord from Sad Cypress, who gets Poirot involved to help Eleanor, and whom Poirot sort of sets up with Eleanor in the end. And also, leaving Christie's novels behind, there is a relatively major character in her play The Patient, part of Rule of Three. Dr. Ginsburg is, broadly speaking, a Watson/Hastings character in that he assists the investigator and exchanges some theories with him. He's probably closest to a doctor in the Watson role in Christie's canon, except for maybe Dr. Constantine in Orient Express. And by the way, The Patient also has a nurse character, so it may be of interest to you for this episode as well. Well, first off, thank you, listener. But you know what? We will not be discussing Nurse Bond from The Patient on this episode, because even though there aren't quite as many nurses of Agatha Christie as there are doctors, there are still definitely too many to cover, every single one. But I do appreciate the heads up. Thank you for being so on top of it. Claire, I just want to give you the opportunity to opine on Dr. Griffith or perhaps even Dr. Ginsburg or any other doctors that we may have missed.
I've actually thought of one we have missed who is quite a significant one. Dr. Lloyd from the Tuesday Club Murders is obviously part of the club that talks about previous murders and obviously very much features as part of that club. So I realised afterwards that we missed him from our list as well.
Oh, yes. I think that I mentioned him really briefly in passing. In the episode, I think, but sometimes those things make it into the notes, but they don't actually make it on the episode. So I'm honestly not sure.
If you did, just ignore me. But if you didn't, yeah, that's another one. But who knows? There may even be more.
I'm sure that there are more. And I actually, because you know me, I love reading through listener mail. I just wanted to read a couple of other responses that people had here to our Doctors episode. So here goes. You threw in the list on unmemorable doctors, Dr. Griffith, and that's really unfair in my opinion. But then I find your opinion of The Moving Finger very harsh, too. It's a top 10 book for me. Dr. Griffith is sweet and competent. What more do you need? He is charmingly awkward when he tries to flirt with Joanna, showing pictures of diseased lungs, smiley face. However, when the time comes for action, he takes control and saves the lives of a mother and a newborn baby. Justice for Dr. Griffith. Fair enough, listener. Just wanted to read out that other impassioned defense of Dr. Griffith. But this listener, who is a teacher, then actually also weighed in on our top doctor of the canon with a really great observation. So continuing on with this message. I absolutely agree with your breakdown of why we trust Dr. Shepard. I use the same arguments with my senior class when we study narrative manipulation. I just add one argument to those you have already mentioned, and that's his name. It sounds remarkably close to Shepard, to me. Aside from calling him Dr. Good Guy, really, Shepard is a name that evokes a positive, unconscious bias, in my opinion. I think that is such a great point. I think Christie is absolutely doing that here. She chose her names very carefully. So thank you, listener, for writing in about that. All right, next message. Just finished listening to this marvelous podcast, enjoyed it immensely, on the subject of how differently Poirot and Marple interact with physicians. It has made me wonder if I have been too influenced by David Suchet's iconic performance in the series. The fastidiousness of the character in general, the need to make sure that he is bundled up securely from the often inhospitable English weather, and a preoccupation with his health in general, has always struck me as revealing Poirot to be a bit of a hypochondriac. As such, although he might not be foolish enough to believe in every medical suggestion, he seems to have had a higher regard for doctors in general than Miss Marple, who had a very skeptical opinion of them. But again, I wish I could clarify in my own mind as to whether that hypochondriacal attitude was present in the books or was very much exaggerated in the television program. Considering how much time Sir David devoted himself into trying to immerse himself completely in the character as written, I am tempted to believe that there is evidence of this in the books and short stories, but I really would like to see that confirmed. And I'll just pause from this message and say, I'm not going to go through any textual evidence now because we have so much else to cover, but I do think that while David Suchet takes this characteristic much further, and I'm so glad he did. It's one of my favorite things about his portrayal of the character because there's a lot of comedy in it. I do think there is evidence for it in the text. So I would say that it doesn't come out of nowhere, though it's also fair to say that Suchet's Poirot is much more of a hypochondriac, perhaps even partially defined by his hypochondriacal ways than Christie's Poirot. I'm curious how you feel about that, Claire.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've actually had similar thoughts reading the books and watching the adaptations and thinking, am I now too influenced by the David Suchet portrayal? But I agree that it doesn't come out of nowhere. I think there's a lot in the text that influences the character he portrays. And I think he does it so incredibly well. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, definitely. It's more of an amplification sort of a situation, and so smart. I mean, he gets so much out of that in the series. Okay, back to this message. In short, I feel that Miss Marple had a tendency to feel that whatever aches, pains, and illnesses she was experiencing might easily be something temporary that would sort itself out in time without the need to consult a physician. While Poirot, on the other hand, even if he did not immediately seek a physician's advice, would be very concerned that any little symptom might eventually lead to something serious. On the other hand, I don't recall Miss Marple saying anything in particular about dentists, while Poirot seems to have an existential dread about visiting them, which always made me wonder if that was something he had in common with his creator due to Agatha's lifelong love of sweets. And I love that. Excellent point. Probably Agatha Christie had a little bit of a tortured relationship with her dentist, as so many of us do. Friend of the podcast, Brad Friedman, also wrote in on these differing stances between Monsieur Poirot and Miss Marple as to doctors. Here's what he had to say. I really enjoyed your comparison between Poirot's and Miss Marple's views of doctors. I do think you're onto something with Poirot in that he was a professional who viewed doctors as fellow professionals, and his OCD would have thrilled to the sterilized instruments and clean white offices of a top-notch Harley Street specialist. As for Miss Marple, I think she lived in a Victorian world where the qualifications and professionalism of doctors was always suspect. Nicholas Nickleby was written in 1838 to 1839. The orphan boys were given a daily dose of brimstone and treacle to purify their blood and stop their hunger. Sweeney Todd takes place soon after that, in 1845, which probably is at least close to when Miss Marple was born. It was a world where barbers pulled teeth and the doctors at Fogg's Asylum were dangerous quacks. The British medical system was based on a study of the four humors of the body until surprisingly late. The use of leeches was only seriously curtailed in the 20th century and is actually back in favor today. Why would Miss Marple trust doctors? Thank you for that, Brad. Brad also mentioned Dr. Owen Griffith as a doctor for whom he has a particular fondness. I get it, listeners. You love Dr. Griffith. Sheesh. I also heard from a listener on social media who pointed out that there is actually another extremely tangential doctor character in The Man in the Brown Suit. This is the doctor who tended to Anne Bedingfeld's dear departed papa, one of England's greatest living authorities on primitive man, but not for long because he couldn't manage to remember to dress properly for the weather, and he dies of double pneumonia at the end of chapter 1. And at the beginning of chapter 2, we get this amusing exchange between Anne and this doctor. Finally, the doctor called upon me, and after making various ridiculous excuses for failing to send a proper bill, he hummed and hawed a good deal and suddenly suggested I should marry him. I was very much astonished. The doctor was nearer 40 than 30 and a round, tubby little man. He was not at all like the hero of The Perils of Pamela, and even less like the stern and silent Rhodesian. I reflected a minute and then asked why he wanted to marry me. That seemed to fluster him a good deal, and he murmured that a wife was a great help to a general practitioner. The position seemed even more unromantic than before, and yet something in me urged towards its acceptance. Safety. That was what I was being offered. Safety and a comfortable home. Thinking it over now, I believe I did the little man an injustice. He was honestly in love with me, but a mistaken delicacy prevented him from pressing his suit on those lines. Anyway, my love of romance rebelled. "It's extremely kind of you," I said, "but it's impossible. I could never marry a man unless I loved him madly." "You don't think—" "No, I don't," I said firmly. He sighed. "But, my dear child, what do you propose to do?" "Have adventures and see the world," I replied without the least hesitation. And so she did. So in a way, this unnamed doctor was another catalyst for the adventure to come. Thank you for that catch, listener. Okay, I have one final listener message as to the doctors of Agatha Christie, so here goes. And you have exactly one guess as to which doctor gets mentioned first in this message. "I understand why Dr. Owen Griffith from The Moving Finger only got a very quick mention, as he's not a huge figure in plot terms, but I'd argue that his role in the story is more significant. He does, after all, end up with Jerry's sister Joanna due to her helping him deliver a baby, as a result of which she's so struck by the strength of character needed to do his job that she moves on from her usual type of spineless young man, to quote Jerry. There's also his sister Amy. I find the part of the book where she talks about how she wanted to be a doctor and knew she would be a good one, but her father wouldn't pay the fees, where he gladly paid them for Owen, very moving and an unusually explicit commentary from Christie on the restrictions on women's lives and ambitions at this time. Notwithstanding The Moving Finger's dodgy gender politics, I think Amy in general is a really interesting and sympathetic character, with Christie showing how her frustrated intellectual energy and potential leads her to be over-involved in village good works and vulnerable to fixation on Richard Symington. In fact, I'd go further and say this is Christie further subverting the trope of the poison pen letter writer as a sexually rather than intellectually frustrated single woman, which she uses to mislead the reader in this book. Moving on to a Caribbean mystery, Miss Marple's encounters with Dr. Graham are some of my favorite Marple scenes in the entire canon. They brilliantly show off her character, including her ability to be very tricksy as needed, play on expectation of her as a vulnerable old woman, and then turn and be absolutely steely and clear. I think they're very funny as well. I love how she makes up first an ailment, hesitating over whether to exaggerate her shoulder pain or her knee pain, before going with her knee pain, then goes all fluttery around her imaginary nephew to try and locate the photo, and then finally just fronts up, explains she lied, and why, with the result that Major Palgrave gets exhumed. I enjoyed Claire's thoughts on how medical practice has changed and what would be less possible for doctors to get away with in the modern era. However, one real-world situation that I was surprised didn't get a mention was the case of Dr. Harold Shipman. I wasn't sure if you weren't aware of him or whether you, very understandably, chose not to mention his case on the podcast, as it is still quite recent history and very distressing, especially perhaps for your UK listeners. If you are not aware of him, he was a GP who has the awful distinction of being the UK's most prolific serial killer. Though interestingly, I do not think he's the first person who would spring to mind if that question was asked. He is thought to have killed around 250 patients over a span of about 30 years, up until the late 1990s. They were mostly vulnerable people, especially older women, who he killed with overdoses of pain-killing medication. His motives are not clear, though he is thought to have benefited through wills and theft of jewelry. There have been various changes to the death certification process and to medical appraisal in the UK as a result of his crimes. However, I think part of what his case illustrates is how much individual power doctors still have, especially in community care with vulnerable people, where a lot of home visits still happen and where audits of records, etc. is still very dependent on what the practitioner chooses to record. On a lighter note, I have many, many thoughts about John Christo, but I will save them for another time. And you know what, listener? You will probably not be surprised to hear that Claire did make mention of Dr. Harold Shipman in her notes for that episode. And we don't have time to get into it on this episode either, or else I would turn to Claire right now and she could tell us all about Dr. Shippen. But I do appreciate you bringing up that topic. So thank you for those excellent observations, listeners. All of you listeners, that listener in particular, and all of you listeners who wrote in. I just so appreciate all of these messages, and I wanted to give them all their due. And I will close out this mini mailbag segment as I opened it with a self-criticism, which was another really small correction that I picked up while scouring Murder in Mesopotamia for this episode. I wonder why. But Dr. Riley actually writes the foreword and chapter 1 of Murder in Mesopotamia. I believe that I had said he just writes the foreword in our Doctor's episode, so I don't want to shortchange his literary contribution to that novel. And given that the end of chapter 1 has Eric Leidner surveying Nurse Leatherin and thinking to himself that she will do, Dr. Riley, I think, has some mystery writing and cluing skills all of his own, which rival Dr. Haydock's even. So I just wanted to clarify that.
You can't predict the future, but you can prepare for it. Arizona State University is building degrees for what's ahead, taught by world-class faculty who are shaping our future. Explore over 350 programs offered online at asuonline.asu.edu.
If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now everything's on sale during our Memorial Day event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses for a limited time. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number, to a good night's sleep.
I think we are now ready, at long last, to turn from the doctors to the nurses. And Claire, you have done some really, really fantastic research that I just want to showcase before we dive into our top dozen nurses of Agatha Christie. So why don't you take it away? We have some terms here that we're going to define, because that is how any scholarly analysis should begin, with a definition of terms. Take it away.
Okay, so I thought it'd be useful just to clarify that today we are focusing on medically trained nurses, and therefore we're not covering the many nursery nurses, nursemaids. Christie has herself had one in childhood who was known as nursey, nursery governesses, and companions we will touch upon later, but really we are focusing on medically qualified nurses. So for the purpose of this episode, if we talk about matrons, a matron was a head of all nursing staff. So that was the most senior role found in hospitals. And they were actually phased out by the NHS in the 1960s as they began to be viewed as outdated. A sister, which we often read about in Christie, is a senior, highly experienced nurse who would usually be running the daily operations of a ward. A charge nurse is a male equivalent of a sister. A district nurse is a community nurse. And I know, Kemper, you picked up on Miss Marple in The Blue Geranium, actually making references to the district nurse. We'll obviously be discussing this short story a lot more later on, but this is a thoroughly nurse-soaked story. And Miss Marple was talking animatedly to the elderly Dr. Lloyd about the workhouse and the suspected shortcomings of the district nurse. So this nurse even comes back in the rather fantastic final line of the story, in which Miss Marple is talking about how wickedness will infiltrate a person if allowed to take root. So again, she then goes on to say that I don't think the poor district nurse is long for her job in St. Mary Mead or Greater Much Benham. So really a district nurse. We do see this later on. Nurse Hopkins is referred to as a district nurse, and it just basically means a nurse who works in the community and visits people at home. And then an orderly, which is mentioned at least a couple of times in the canon, is usually a male worker. They're not actually a trained nurse, but they are an attendant or a support worker type of role. And they usually helped with heavy lifting, patient transportation, serving food, and cleaning of hospitals or care facilities. So very much a practical support worker. And then a nursing home had a slightly different meaning in the earlier part of the 20th century to the meaning that it has today. So it was really a private, small residential home where nursing care was provided. And today we very much associate that with more elderly care. In the early part of the 20th century, it really could be anybody from any age who is in a nursing home. It was usually for the middle classes who could afford that kind of nursing care. And then sometimes we see hospitals described as a cottage hospital. So for anyone who's not familiar with that, that is basically a very small community-based rural facility. So typically there would be anywhere between 5 and 30 beds, so a very small hospital. And that would provide local medical care. They may also do things such as minor surgery and nursing care for people who are local in that village. And that would help people to avoid the long journeys into cities to attend hospitals there. And then we also do have quite a lot of reference to Broadmoor Hospital. So again, anyone who's not familiar with Broadmoor, it's the oldest high security psychiatric hospital in England, in Berkshire, and still is in existence today. Many patients are sent there via the criminal justice system. And there is also Bethlem Royal Hospital, which is more commonly known as Bedlam. So it's not a high security psychiatric hospital, but it is still very much a major psychiatric hospital that's in Bromley, near London. And it's actually 750 years old now. So it's actually founded in 1247. And we do see the word Bedlam used a lot in literature, but also slang. If somebody describes a place as, it's Bedlam in here, what they mean is it's kind of insane what's going on today, or it might be used to describe a group or so on. And I know, Kemper, you noted as well that there's an American equivalent to Broadmoor, which is Bellevue in New York City. It's the oldest public hospital in the US and has a major psychiatric wing, to the point where Bellevue became a term for a psychiatric hospital setting just generally. So very similar to the English Bedlam there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a major nursing school as well. And I should just note, I know, Claire, you come from a family of nurses. My mother actually trained as a nurse at Bellevue, and my grandmother was a nurse in the Second World War. We'll talk about that a little bit because there are some fictional counterparts of her experience that I think will come up in our conversation. So we're both well steeped.
That is very cool.
In nursing, yeah. And, especially on the category of characters who can be sorted under the companion umbrella, there's definitely some fuzziness there, I would say. And I think we'll be grappling with that as we cover a couple of these characters, because there are some characters within Christie that are companions and not really medical companions whatsoever. They're much more social companions, but especially when you have the dynamic of and it's often a younger female caring for an older female, there is that medical aspect. And I think the line between a purely social companion and a more nurse-like medical companion gets a little bit blurry. And so we erred on the side of covering some of those people, but there's some wiggle room there. So there might be some people we're covering, and you might think to yourself, well, I never thought of that character as a quote-unquote nurse. But because I think nursing, as distinct in a way from medicine, the kind of medicine that we were talking about in our doctor's episode, there's this idea that nursing is something that really can be done within the domestic circle, which I think makes for a little bit more fuzziness. And this is actually just my way of trying to seamlessly transition into another wonderful overview that Claire has done of the ways in which nursing as a practice and a profession changed over the course of Agatha Christie's writing career. So I would love it, Claire, if you could just give us a bit of an overview before we start considering individual characters.
Absolutely. So you've already mentioned, Kemper, that Florence Nightingale really founded nursing. She significantly improved nursing standards in the mid-1800s. And that was really mainly through better hygiene and sanitation. And so she actually worked in some military hospitals in the Crimean War, and she actually reduced the death rate from 42% to just 2% by improving better hygiene standards. And then when she returned to England, she did a similar kind of thing here and was very much recognised and noted as a pioneer really for nursing. So in 1860, the Nightingale Training School actually opened in St. Thomas's Hospital in London. And so throughout most of the 20th century, nursing was based on the Nightingale model. And so when Agatha Christie started writing in the 1910s, nursing really was still quite Victorian in that sense. But this was a fascinating decade because nursing actually changed significantly. At the beginning of the decade, really anybody could call themselves a nurse, and that might mean that they actually have no real scientific or medical training. Perhaps they were just in more of a caregiving role, but they could absolutely say they were a nurse. And all of that began to change very rapidly. The First World War obviously started in 1914, and suddenly there was a huge demand for nurses that just wasn't really prepared for. And so with those shortages, this led to the rise of partially trained voluntary aid detachment nurses, or just known as VADs later on. They were actually founded by the British Red Cross and the Order of St. John. And these volunteer nurses that were so desperately needed to attend to injured soldiers, both returning to England from the war, but also in Europe as well. They often only received 6 weeks of training. And obviously that was a huge difference from normal nurse training, which was typically 3 years long and still is today. So as you can imagine, it wasn't surprising that some of these qualified nurses who'd done their 3 years training had some real concerns about people that had just been trained for 6 weeks and then were suddenly let loose on hospital wards. And so we do see some of the descriptions in Mysterious Affair of Styles and The Secret Adversary on what that nursing character looked like. And also often those nurses had to work across departments in hospitals, particularly as staff shortages became more prominent. So, of course, we know Christie did this and then worked in the dispensary. So we see those descriptions as well in those early Christies. And so in 1916, the Royal College of Nursing was founded with just 34 members. And this was founded to regulate the profession and to start to raise nursing standards. Then in 1919, due to the Nurses Registration Act, nursing becomes a registered profession. So what this means is that nobody can just call themselves a nurse anymore. They have to do a particular type of training. They are then registered to prove that they are actually a trained and qualified nurse. And this, again, is raising professional standards. And it also means there's accountability because a nurse can be struck off this register for any kind of malpractice or misconduct, and then effectively their career would be over. So it really is driving that accountability at this point. And just an interesting side note here, doctors had actually been registered since 1858 and midwives had been registered since 1902. So nurses were kind of late to the party, which some of the nurses were really unhappy about. They really had been pushing for this change for a long time. And other nurses didn't want to be registered. And Florence Nightingale was actually part of that camp that was backing nurses not to be registered because she strongly believed that nursing is a vocation. You need to be devout. It's a calling. And if it becomes a science, there's a risk that it takes away from that vocation. There were also other concerns that if educational standards were required for nursing, that would exclude working class women and it would become almost a ladies' profession for wealthier, more educated women. And of course, if you're raising the standards, there's also that concern that people will demand more pay and that doctors would actually have more authority over the training. And a lot of matrons didn't want that. They wanted to continue to be the ones who would train new nurses. So there were actually quite a few people against this. And of course, there were people who were for this and very much believed that that's exactly what nursing is. It is a medical science, and it really needs to have that prestige and the same kind of standards that hold people accountable that doctors have. So that's why it took a little bit of time to get there.
That's so fascinating to me because I think you can see that in, you mentioned that nurses are sometimes called sister, right? That they can be referred to as sister, which is a little bit of a holdover from when there were religious orders, right? Like orders of nuns who would do a lot of the nursing work, which I think shows that kind of vocational history. And the Florence Nightingale approach is very kind of devotional with, a very individual passion behind it. So it's just interesting that you can see a lot of that influence still, I think, in the way that the nurses kind of carry themselves and even interact, and even just in the very title of how they're referred to. And I remember that as a child, that used to always really confuse me. Why are they is this a nun? Like, is this person a nun or just a nurse? Like what? And I could never understand why they were calling each other that. But I think it's just so different from this history really is distinct from the history of the doctors. So just wanted to call that out.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very interesting. The other thing I just wanted to mention about this decade was at the beginning of the decade, before we get to this point where we have the Royal College of Nursing and registration, the nurse training that nurses received really it wasn't standardized in any way or regulated. So it really depended on the person who trained you as to what kind of training that you were going to receive. And sometimes there were textbooks that were issued, which nurses would study. And one of those was Materia Medica, which is Latin for medical materials. And that's how nurses would obtain knowledge about medicines. Today, we would just call that pharmacology, just a study of pharmaceuticals and medicines. And the reason I mention this is because it's relevant in the mysterious affair of Styles as to how Evelyn Howard knew about medication. It was very likely she would have studied something like that. And of course, as nursing progresses through the decades, there is more emphasis on science and chemistry and pharmacology. So moving to the 1920s, nurse training is still very much taking place in hospitals as an apprenticeship type model. There is some attempt to move towards a more formal education, but in reality, it's still heavily hospital based. And wealthy patients could easily hire live-in nurses. And we see that, of course, a lot in Christie. Again, we have sometimes companions who are blending that medical and social role. And we also have nursing homes and convalescent homes that start to pop up. And by 1927, they are officially registered. So that's the kind of home that Captain Hastings went to when he was injured in the First World War. And with those nursing homes, there was some inequality, because if you were fortunate enough to be able to afford good care, you would probably have a very good experience and you would be cared for by qualified nurses. If you were from a working class background, you would be more likely to go into a nursing home that would actually have been a former workhouse. So I know a lot of us, when we hear the word workhouse, we have very much that Dickensian image in our mind, but actually they weren't officially abolished in England until 1948. And so some of those homes, unfortunately, still have very much a workhouse mentality and approach to care. So they weren't so great reputation-wise. But at the end of this decade, we're actually seeing a surplus of nurses. So, of course, the First World War is now over. There isn't the need for all these nurses. And we see that with Tuppence in The Secret Adversary. When we first meet her, she is unemployed. Even though she has nursed during the First World War, there is no need for her anymore. And this is the first and last time we're going to see a surplus of nurses in the 20th century. From here on out, it's pretty much always a shortage of nurses we're seeing. So that's just an interesting time in history when we actually have too many nurses. And so moving to the 1930s, nursing is now pretty much an established profession. It's predominantly female. It's a challenging profession that's characterized by low pay, long hours, and a strict discipline with a rigid hospital hierarchy. And so for those reasons, unfortunately, there is quite a high turnover in nursing. But despite the high turnover and despite the economic depression that occurs in the 1930s, there are significant developments in training improvements, in the standards of professionalism. We see an introduction of assistant nurses and even some medical changes, such as very early use of oxygen therapy. And so the decade closes out with the profession preparing for the demands of the Second World War. Very much towards the end of that decade, everybody in England knows that war is coming, and therefore there is going to be a significant need for nursing. And in the 1930s, medicines and poisons are still fairly easy to obtain. And that's why throughout Christie, we do still see a lot of poisonings, even into the 1940s. We're not quite there yet where it's strictly regulated and harder to get hold of those medicines. So moving to the 1940s, two of the biggest changes that we see in this decade is, of course, the Second World War and the birth of the NHS, the National Health Service, in 1948. So nurses are actually working in quite horrific conditions on the home front. So, for example, the Blitz, they're working during the blackout, where, of course, there is no light. Often electricity and water supplies have been disrupted due to bombing. So nurses are learning very quickly how to deal with trauma, emergency care, triage situations. And so, as with a lot of wars, medical advances are rapidly progressing because of this. And nurses are actually starting to gain professional recognition and technical skills at unprecedented levels because of these changes. So things like antibiotics are now becoming really standard. Penicillin is introduced during the Second World War. And this is where nurses really change from the quiet caregiver, maybe in the background, to actually a skilled clinical professional. Moving on to the 1950s, the NHS is in its bedding in period, still relatively new here. The issues around nursing as a profession, such as the long hours and the low pay, don't really significantly improve, unfortunately. There is a lot of staffing shortages and retention rates are pretty poor. And so this encourages the UK to actually look overseas to fill some of these vacancies, so particularly towards the Caribbean. And throughout this decade, we see some changes in elderly care. It's now moving more towards institutional care. So we start to see nursing homes and care homes really just for elderly care. But antibiotics, steroids, sedatives, early psychiatric medications are all really starting to take off in this decade. However, they were poorly regulated, particularly compared to today. So misuse and overdose were serious concerns. And so by the 1960s, medicine is becoming less personal and more system-driven. So there are improvements to professional standards, but there is much more of an evidence-based approach to medicine. And that's largely due to the influence of the NHS. So we kind of move away from that one-on-one caring in people's homes, although for the wealthy, that definitely is still a possibility, but it's become much more government type care with the NHS now. And Miss Marple actually notes in the Mirror Cracked from Side to Side that devoted maidservants had gone out of fashion. In real illness, you could have a proper hospital nurse at vast expense and procured with difficulty, or you could go to hospital. But after the critical phase of illness had passed, you were down to the missed nights. So what Miss Marple is alluding to there is that the healthcare system is absolutely going to be there for you if you're critically ill. You can go to hospital, you can have a nurse if you can afford it. But after that, you're really down to your companion/friend who may or may not be medically qualified, probably not, and may drive you a little bit crazy. So that's quite an interesting Yes. Yes, I mean, the book really has only just opened at this point, and we know Miss Knight is driving her crazy. So that's how the 1960s was looking. And matrons were also being phased out from hospitals at this point. This was another issue that was really not helping the retention of nurses, just this very rigid, strict hierarchy. And so as we move into the 1970s, nurses are actually starting to fight back against things like the low pay and the long hours and just their working conditions overall. So there were strikes in the 1970s. And in 1974, there was actually a protest rally in Hyde Park in London. And that did result in a 30% pay rise for nurses. So it's really starting to change here as the 70s progresses, and nurses are really finding their voice and their confidence to speak up about better working conditions. What was also happening at this time was the apprenticeship model, where nurses were trained in hospitals, was being more openly criticised, and there was more demand for a professional education. And so actually now there was a Bachelor of Science degree in nursing, and the first graduates actually emerged in 1977. So there was an option now for it to be a degree. And we see more of that as the century ended. So with the end of the 1970s, nurses had more formal training and professional authority than ever. They're very much professionals that are held to quite strict legal frameworks for patient safety and accountability. And again, at the end of this decade, nurses are heavily supported throughout the NHS by international nurses who have come from the Caribbean, Malaysia, Ireland, different parts of Asia as well, to help with those staffing issues. So yeah, very interesting changes that we see over the 20th century.
Huge changes. And I think we can see so many echoes of those very changes in Christie's books, which is what we'll be discussing. I mean, maybe if the nurses had gotten that 30% pay rise in 1974, a few years earlier, the nursing homes in By the Pricking of My Thumbs wouldn't have been such an absolute mess. And so lax as to, essentially allow a killer to ply her trade in various places. But we'll get there. We will be discussing that. Thank you so much for that, Claire. That's a ton of work goes into that, but I think it's so helpful to be able to get that overview of how things were changing. And it's just fascinating to me how distinct it really is from the history of doctors, especially in that nurses were starting from that different place where you even had that argument over whether or not this should be a quote unquote profession. And it's endlessly fascinating to me that Florence Nightingale, like the founder of modern nursing, was anti but you explained the nuances of that, I think, so well as to why that is, because it's actually a more complicated argument than it might seem to be on its face. So
yeah, I was fascinated by that too, because I really thought she would want those standards to be as high as they could possibly be. But I guess it makes sense that she very much believed it was a vocation and was worried that it might attract people who don't see it as a vocation. So yeah, totally, especially at her time, it wasn't so much about a science. So it does make sense.
Yeah, I know. It's like Florence Nightingale, the sanitation queen,
What would you do if your online store converted 36% more shoppers? You could take 36% more vacation.
Another pina colada? Yes, please.
Open a new retail location with 36% more square feet.
Fantastic.
Hire 36% more help.
You're hired and you're hired.
Shopify has the world's best converting checkout, up to 36% better than other e-commerce platforms. What you do with those extra sales is up to you. Switch to Shopify today at shopify.com/listen and get a $1 trial. Shopify.com/listen.
I drive my bus in a busy city. That's why road safety is so important to me. I know that I must slow down and be extra careful when I make a wide turn. Buses need more room than cars. Everyone can help keep our roads safe. Next time you're driving, remember to give buses plenty of time and space to finish turning before driving ahead. Let's all plan to share the road safely. Learn how at www.sharetheroadsafely.gov.
let's address a question that we addressed in the doctor's episode, which is, why do nurses appear so frequently in Agatha Christie's works? And I already mentioned it's almost as frequent as doctors. I think not quite, but boy, are there nurses everywhere in Christie. And I think we have a lot of really interesting answers to this question. So why don't you tackle it first?
Sure. So as I mentioned, in World War I era, we see a significant increase in nurses. So actually, nurses became quite prominent figures in the early 20th century. So as the golden age of detective fiction is flourishing in between the wars, it's not surprising that nurses are this now familiar figure. And probably anywhere you went at that time, you could definitely see a nurse out and about in town, in a country house, maybe in a hotel. It wouldn't be unusual to see nurses in public. So I think writing about them and including them as characters made sense at that time that Christie was writing, and then, of course, later as well. So I think they really do make good background characters. So they are good observers and witnesses. They can observe many things about a patient as well as just their symptoms, what mood the patient might be in, what words were spoken perhaps before a patient died. They can also be a good alibi. So, for example, in Death on the Nile, we have Miss Bowers who's with Jacqueline all night, which gives her a great alibi. So they can be really useful for that kind of reason as well.
I realize that doctors are also supposed to observe, that is a core part of examining a patient, but it feels like observation, the sort of like stepping back and observing of a patient is just truly such a core part of what a nurse does, that they really are perfect witnesses, if not more, in a murder mystery. And they're just so well placed in so many of these stories. And, you know, you were the one who pointed this out, Claire. I don't want to take credit for it, but nurses have legitimate reasons to be anywhere in a house if there is a patient. So if they're spotted wandering around at night, for example, they can always provide an explanation that is unlikely to be questioned because they do have that professional expertise to back them up. And there's always water to be boiled or bandages to be retrieved from a bag or an excuse for a syringe to be lying around. And given, especially in some, I think of those earlier novels, that we have that fuzziness between the social role and the medical role when it was not as strictly a professional kind of a pursuit, it's that much more fodder, I think, for mystery hijinks than even a medical doctor. I think one of the biggest reasons when we're talking about Agatha Christie specifically is that, of course, Agatha Christie herself had experience nursing and working in hospitals, which is something that we've talked about so very many times on this podcast. She worked as a nurse in the First World War before she switched over to the dispensary, and then she continued that pharmaceutical work in the Second World War. But she enjoyed that nursing work a great deal that she did during the war, as rigorous and I'm sure upsetting as it could be. And she actually says in her autobiography that she would have liked to have been a nurse if she hadn't gotten married. And I just think for this episode, it is worth pulling out that quote because you know that I never miss an opportunity to quote from the autobiography. So I am just going to pull that out right now. Here's what she says. From the beginning, I enjoyed nursing. I took to it easily and found it, and have always found it, one of the most rewarding professions that anyone can follow. I think, if I had not married, that after the war I should have trained as a real hospital nurse. Maybe there is something in heredity. My grandfather's first wife, my American grandmother, was a hospital nurse. We're more used to hearing about Auntie Granny, who was her grandfather's second wife, right? And her father's stepmother, and in some weird ways, her mother's stepmother also. But it's really interesting that her grandfather's first wife, the biological mother of her father, was a hospital nurse, and that she would think about that as she was reminiscing about how much she enjoyed her nursing work. And there really is a lot of detailed description of Christie's own nursing work in the Great War in her autobiography. I was revisiting it for this episode, and I was interested to see that Christie, like Tuppence Beresford, though she was Tuppence Cowley at the time. She was not yet married. We will get to Tuppence's nursing work later in this episode, but Christie actually served first as a ward maid, which is essentially a member of the help who cleaned the town hall in Torquay, which had been converted into a hospital for the war. So she was polishing brass and cleaning floors and whatnot. I love that image. And she talks about after she graduated from ward maid, just after a number of days to being a nurse, that she disgraced herself by fainting during the first operation that she witnessed as a nurse in the operating theater, and how the nurse who was supervising her was unexpectedly kind about it. She expected to be chewed out because she talks in the autobiography about how these nurses didn't really have much patience for all of these women who were volunteering and saying they wanted to be nurses during the war. And if you didn't have, the stuff to make it, they had no use for you. But this nurse was very kind and essentially told her that it gets better. And it did. And she said that she survived the next operation, and that she learned if she didn't look too closely when the original incision was made, that she was okay. And I have to say, having finished season 2 of The Pit, we had to mention The Pit on this episode as well. I kind of know what she means. I've never actually witnessed an operation live and in person, but the initial incision, when that knife's going puncturing into the skin, that's very real. She said the truth of it is one gets used to anything. So that is how she became used to her nursing work during the war. And it's really clear that she was very serious about that work and that her experience had a big impact on her. And let's not forget that Agatha Christie, because she was married to Archie Christie at this point during the war, of course, that she had made this handmade magazine with her nursing colleagues titled What We Did in the Great War. I did an episode around this magazine on the podcast a year or so ago. And the magazine is very lighthearted. It was clearly a way for these workers to let off some steam. They were writing poems and composing songs. And I believe there's even a comic strip. There are 2 copies of it in existence, which differ slightly since it is handmade. One of them is in the Christie archive. And then another was lent by the British Psychoanalytical Society archive to be displayed at the Royal College of Nursing, which Claire was just mentioning, first came about during the First World War. So that's a bit of a full circle moment. Yeah, I just think that we can't really overestimate how important Christie's own experiences as a nurse were to Christie, the creator of mysteries and the writer of fiction. And I mentioned in our Doctors of Agatha Christie episode that there is a ton of material about Christie's nursing duties that's funneled into Giant's Bread, which is the first of her Mary Westmacott novels. That's where we have the character of Nell, who is clearly a stand-in for Christie as she becomes a nurse during the Great War. Lots of details about the hierarchy among the senior nurses and their personalities and their interactions with the doctors, all sorts of stuff. We just don't have time to quote any of that here, but if you're interested, I highly recommend that you check out Giant's Bread. I think she honestly goes into greater depth than she does in the autobiography, but she also deals with the subject pretty thoroughly in the autobiography as well. And this is the first time I really thought of this, but as I was, sitting down and pondering all of the different ways that Agatha Christie's personal experiences as a nurse have been brought to bear on her fiction, I found myself wondering, well, what about Unfinished Portrait? Because that is the Mary Westmacott novel that's very straightforwardly autobiographical. And in some ways, you can read it side by side with certain passages in the autobiography, and they're almost the same, except that a lot of emotional coloring has been added to Unfinished Portrait. And I was like, I don't think that the Christie fictional avatar in that book, whose name is Celia, I don't think that Celia actually was a nurse. So I went back into the text, and it's true. She wants to volunteer with the Red Cross and become a nurse during the Great War. But Celia is a little bit more delicate than the real life Christie. I think that, again, there's some emotional truth to that because that's how Christie often felt, in her own mind about herself. And she ends up devoting herself to caring for the character in that book, who's clearly based on her Auntie Granny. I thought it was interesting that Christie included so much of her real life experiences in that book, but not as to nursing. And maybe she felt that she had done it already with Nell in Giant's Bread. Maybe she enjoyed just exploring that version of herself who couldn't hack it, who couldn't handle it because it was such a rigorous job. But yeah, just really, really clear that nursing was important to her on a personal level. I have gone on about that long enough. Claire, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it really does show how much Christie enjoyed her time. And I think we'll probably get to it later, but certainly the nursing stays with Tuppence throughout her life. And I think it did with Christie as well. I think she brings it into so many of her books, even sometimes just very subtly. And I think she absolutely enjoyed those experiences and never really forgot them. So I think that's, very interesting.
Yeah, and I think it was also remarkable to me as I was looking through her canon for this episode, just how many non-nurse characters will casually mention that they did a bit of nursing in the war.
Yeah.
It's really all over the place. I pulled one of them just as an example. So we get passages like this in A Caribbean Mystery, which I think are representative of this phenomenon in the oeuvre. This is when Miss Marple is first observing Mr. Raphael's secretary, Mrs. Walters. She behaved like a well-trained hospital nurse. Possibly, thought Miss Marple, she had been a hospital nurse. So it's not like Mrs. Walters is a notable nurse within the canon, like we're not going to consider her a nurse, but this notion that she is nurse-like and could have been a nurse at some point is a very, very common observation that we get in Christie's work. And I think as a former nurse herself, like that's just often how she thought about people. And so many of the people she knew had her experience and had been nurses during the war or knew nurses or were just within that milieu in some way, which is just, I think, very different from our experience in the 21st century. I think if you're a nurse, you're a nurse, and maybe you have someone in your family who's a nurse, but I think it was a lot more common given that huge influx during the Great War. So it's just really worth highlighting that. I'd also love to just call out the fact that Christie liked to play around with the trope of the malingerer, right? The invalid who's not really an invalid. And I think nurses are very useful characters to place within that scenario because, again, their role is fuzzy. And it's like they could be more of a social/medical companion. And perhaps, yes, we all know that this person isn't actually ill and they just need a friend. So even though I'm here and pretending to be a medical companion, I'm actually much more of a social companion. I do just want to call out the potential ableism of this trope. It's something that my co-hosts and I discussed at great length on the podcast's All About Ableism episode, the idea that these often women, they're very often women, who are complaining about their health are not to be believed and they're not actually sick. That can be very problematic. And, I just want to mention that as we're talking about the malingerer trope, but there's no question that the nurse role is often central to that trope. Do you think that's fair, Claire?
I think so. Again, to kind of quote Miss Bowers in Death on the Nile, when she's asked, as many nurses are, if they think there's anything really wrong with their patient, she says that she doesn't think there's anything seriously wrong with Mrs. Van Schuler, and she likes plenty of attention and she's willing to pay for it. And I think that does sum up some of the wealthy. Again, it's typically women, sometimes men, that, if they want to pay to have somebody tend to their every need and want, then that is exactly what they are going to do. So, yeah. I think that's interesting.
Let's talk about the nurse's uniform, because I think that's peculiarly useful within a mystery, right?
Yes, I think this is so interesting that for the most part in the 20th century England, the nurse's uniform was a long dress, an apron and a hat, very different from what we see today. But of course, that made it such a great disguise for anyone pretending to be a nurse. And we do see quite a lot of characters in the canon doing that, as we'll get to later. Yes, it's a very good and easy disguise, and similar to a nun or a religious figure, because there is that head covering and a great deal of the body is covered. It really does make it easy, particularly again in some books where we get just a glimpse of a nurse and it really just could be anyone. So I think that works so well for the mystery writer at this time.
Yeah, I think when we see a nurse in this traditional uniform from afar, you just see the nurse. You don't really see the person within the uniform. And that's so very useful for Agatha Christie. And I do also think, similar to doctors, that nurses can easily blur the lines of class. They're really not working class servants. They are educated employees, but they often aren't within and among the higher classes themselves. Sometimes in wartime, they were, but that's not something that, after wartime, these were usually people who were pursuing a profession because they needed the money. But that means that they have access to multiple houses and care facilities. They're privy to more information. They have access, again, to all of these medicines that can be used as poisons. And, there are lots of examples in the Christie canon. For example, 450 from Paddington and Sad Cypress, where servants are very irritated by the presence of nurses and their constant demands for trays of tea. Christie mentions that all the time, the trays of tea. It's like nurses always want some extra tea, and the servants just have no patience with that. I mentioned the middle classness of doctors on our doctor episode, and I really do think the same could be said to a certain extent for nurses. It's less that they're necessarily transcending class themselves, going from a lower class origin to becoming on the same footing as the owners of a grand estate, which is something that a highly successful doctor could do. I think they are still in a subservient role, but it's more that a nurse within a household is a little bit like the governess character of the 19th century, right? They occupy this vague, amorphous middle region within the hierarchy, which means that their reach within that household is pretty much limitless. They can easily have a confidential chat with the lowest kitchen maid and just as easily knock on the bedroom door of the lady of the manor, and she will spill all of her secrets. So that is just very, very useful within a murder mystery. And I think we'll see Christie using her nurse characters for exactly those sorts of pursuits. And then, just a few more, I think, qualities of nurses that just particularly suit them for mysteries. Claire, would you like to take those last few?
Sure. So nurses are uncomplicated characters in the sense that most of the time nurses would have been single. It would be unusual for a nurse to be married and still working as a nurse, although not impossible, and on rare occasions that did happen. But I think as the majority of nurses that Christie is writing about were single in her novels and short stories, they don't have any ties in the way of spouses or partners or children or family complications, which is very different from our doctor characters. Sometimes we know about the doctor's siblings, doctors' wives, doctors' parents, brothers, sisters. But with nurses, it's really that they're just there to represent their profession, which makes them good characters to just easily recall facts and to be witnesses. So in many ways, that's similar to other professions in the canon, such as lawyers or solicitors or vicars. They're there just to do the job, and therefore they don't have other layers to them. And I think as well, it's just worth noting that I think most of our detectives have a great respect for nurses. Poirot tells Nurse Hopkins in Sad Cypress that men fight shy of illness, and it's the women who are the ministering angels. What should we do without them? A truly noble calling. And we see, obviously, Tuppence and Miss Marple, who have a little bit of experience of nursing, again, having the greatest of respect for that profession. So that was just worth noting as well.
And definitely no irony in Poirot calling, nurses ministering angels in Sad Cypress, for example. but I think Christie's she's making the point that there's a lot of faith that I think people put in nurses because they are supposed to be in this role of ministering angel and to have this sort of vocation where they are putting you at ease and there's so much trust that you are placing within these characters who are by and large women. I did just want to ask you, Claire, because I know that you, in the same way that you considered the gender breakdown of doctors over the 20th century, you did consider the gender breakdown of nurses. And I was really fascinated to see that the trajectory is very different from what it was with doctors. Could you just talk really briefly about that?
Yes, absolutely. It was really fascinating because in the 1920s, approximately 9% of nurses were male. And that's roughly around 11,000 nurses. They were recorded on the 1921 census. And initially, when records of nurses first began, there were just 15 men. And that 11,000 that were recorded in 1921 compares to 111,000 female nurses. So literally 100,000 more female nurses than male nurses at this time. And the male nurses were mainly from the Royal Army Medical Corps or other services that were created and used throughout the First World War. And often male nurses were restricted to working in specific areas of healthcare, and mainly that was mental health. And that pattern really didn't change a lot throughout the 20th century. And unfortunately, it was really due to the stigma that to work in mental health, you needed a lot of strength. Of course, this was during the time where patients were physically restrained. So there was a belief that you needed to be tall and strong. And so that criteria better fitted the male nurse and the female nurse. By the 1970s, males represented between 9 and 10% of nurses. So 50 years later, the picture really hasn't changed that much. And today it is 11.1% of male nurses in the UK. So again, 2026, it hasn't changed dramatically. And that's not just unique to the UK. In the US, today, 10% of nurses are male. So unfortunately, it really is partly because of that stereotype that nursing is women's work and very much a female profession. And it is sad that that stigma still exists today. I know a lot of the hospitals, particularly training hospitals and nursing associations, are very much trying to change that and very much value male nurses. But it's very interesting to see how we didn't get a significant change in the 20th century compared to doctors, where as the century progressed, we did get more female doctors. So yeah, interesting there on the gender.
I was floored to see those statistics because if you had asked me to guess, I would have definitely said, yeah, I probably think just because of my anecdotal evidence that there certainly are fewer male nurses than female nurses, let's just say in the US, because that's where I am. But I would have said 30, 40%, something like that, just because how could it be as skewed as it was not to have changed essentially at all, which also means, given how many more women obviously are doctors now, that women are just pouring into the medical industry, right? I mean, because they didn't cede any control over, how many nurses there are. And so yay for women, thank God. But that really shocks me. And I think, it shows that those stereotypes are just really pervasive and have not changed. So we've got some work to do.
Yes, absolutely. And I was shocked as well, even having worked in healthcare and trained within the NHS when I was doing my physiotherapy training. I do remember working with charge nurses and male nurses. So it didn't even seem apparent to me when I was actually practically doing the job. So if I had to guess as well, I would have had it definitely higher than 11%. So yeah, totally agree. There is a long way to go.
Yeah. And we will talk about the portrayal of male nurses in Christie, because there are a few. We will not neglect those male nurses. Again, in the same way, Christie is always reflecting her reality. So her reality is that almost all the nurses she came across were female, and that is still our reality, and that is what we see in her fiction. But we do have a few male nurse characters and other male non-doctor medical personnel who we will shout out when the time comes. Okay, before we get into the top dozen nurses of Agatha Christie, we're almost there, listeners. There were some really interesting observations that Claire gathered as she was doing her research. And I would love if you could just go through these now, because I think this too will be a really helpful frame for our conversation when we get to the individuals within the canon.
This was so interesting to do, and I just loved preparing for this episode because I did not expect to find the things that I did. Again, very much when you read it, you just think of the nurse character as just being there. But upon that research, I actually discovered there are no nurse victims in the canon. So very different from the doctors, where we do have several doctor victims. We actually don't have any nurses who are the murder victims. We don't really have the true nurse detective / sidekick. I know you don't quite agree with me there, Kemper, so we'll kind of get to that. But we don't really
We'll get to that argument perhaps later in the episode with one of our top nurses, won't we?
Yes. So, I mean, what I meant by that was we don't really have like this active Hastings or Dr. Shepherd type figure. However, of course, we do have Tuppence Beresford, or Cowley as she starts off as, who of course is one of our key detectives. And I also noticed that the nurse murderers are pretty much always middle-aged or older nurses. And I found that so curious because we do have quite a few young nurses in the canon, but they are never really the murderers. So it's always these older nurses. And I was just curious about whether Christie is kind of drawing on her own experience as a young VAD, where we know from her autobiography, sometimes those older or more senior nurses would really look down on the VADs and be very patronizing and condescending. So was this in some way Christie getting her own back and thinking, I'm going to make those older nurses the villain? That was just really interesting. I also noticed, more or less with the descriptions, the younger nurses who are typically aged between 20 and 30 in the canon. So thinking about Nurse Craven from Curson, Nurse O'Brien from Sad Cypress, Nurse O'Keefe from By the Pricking of My Thumbs, and Janet Smith, a friend of Tuppence's from A Fairy in the Flat or A Pot of Tea in the Partners in Crime series. They are basically the same person. They all have red hair. They're all tall, they're all good-natured, they're all kind. Even the unnamed nurse at the beginning of Towards Zero is described that way as well. In addition to that, Nurse Craven and Nurse O'Brien described as having bright white teeth. And Nurse O'Keefe and O'Brien also are described as having freckles. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of nurses from Ireland did emigrate to England. So not surprising that we see a lot of Irish nurses there. Also in the Hollow, Lady Anketel tells Inspector Grange that talking of hospital nurses just now, I believe that John Christo, I believe a nurse with red hair and an upturned nose, quite attractive. One doesn't really know how much poor Gerda had to put up with. So again, we're getting another reference here to a nurse who's attractive with red hair. I thought that was kind of amusing given our last episode where we talked a lot about Dr. John Christo and what poor Gerda did have to put up with. So now we know he's had several affairs with several nurses. So not surprising there at all. And so those middle-aged and older nurses, such as Nurse Hopkins in Sad Cypress, Nurse Harrison in the Neon Hydra, Nurse Howard in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, and Nurse Carruthers in Dumb Witness. They're all described as middle-aged, sensible, homely, competent, and tall. And in addition, Hopkins and Carruthers are described as plump, and Howard is described as stout with a large, sensible square body with feet to match. So again, pretty much the same person that Christie's describing here. So I felt like, more or less she has an image in her mind of a younger nurse and what they would look like, and then an older nurse and what they would look like, although not entirely, because of course we have one exception that will remain unnamed until we get to the pinnacle of our list. I think this is why I really wanted to go through this now, because this is so fascinating, and I love that you compiled this, Claire, because this is such an insight that it's true. There's the two types, or even tropes, we could say. It's the younger nurse and the middle-aged to older nurse, and there's really, I think, only one shining example of a truly middle of the road as to both age and appearance nurse who does not fall into either category. And maybe she's a very important nurse in the canon. We shall see. Yes. But yeah, the other thing that really tickled me was just, I never thought about the Irishness of so many of these nurses. And even Nurse O'Brien in Sad Cypress, she's really singled out for being super Irish. Like, she has a heavy accent. And I mentioned my grandmother, my Irish grandmother did just that. She emigrated to England. It was during the Second World War with her sister as well, with her Irish sister. And they worked as nurses.
in England. So
I love that. That's
again,
so cool.
This is, Christie reflecting reality. And I never thought about that, how we really have so many of those Irish nurses. And perhaps that's why so many of them have red hair. And I love the idea that she was thinking perhaps a little bit of herself because she was young when she was a nurse, so that she was putting herself in the position of those young nurses. So it is often a bit of a flattering, or at least sunny depiction. And then the somewhat at least strict, shall we say, older nurse who maybe she had to deal with when she was on the receiving end of things as the younger nurse, and that she's getting a little bit back at them, because we will see that some of them are not very nice at all. Some of those nurses. And then I really love this, Claire. So tell us about your discovery of a series-long hospital.
Yes, again, this was totally unexpected, but I love this too. We actually have a series-long hospital. St. Christopher's Hospital is where nurse Amy Leatheran from Murder in Mesopotamia, and later on she also features in Passenger to Frankfurt. She completed her training at St. Christopher's Hospital, and while she's actually in Baghdad, she writes to Sister Kershaw, who is one of her former colleagues, who is obviously still at St. Christopher's Hospital, and she writes to her telling her about her experiences in Baghdad. And then we later find out that Jeffrey Roberts, Dr. Jeffrey Roberts from Cards on the Table, also completed his training at St. Christopher's Hospital. And as if that isn't enough, Dr. John Christo's prize patient, Mrs. Crabtree, is hospitalized there with Ridgway's disease, which we mentioned in the doctor's episode, of course, is not a real disease, but this was the disease that Christo was studying and researching. And he attends to Mrs. Crabtree at St. Christopher's Hospital as part of his research, and he's impressed with her positive attitude towards life. So that is 3 of our characters who all had some association with St. Christopher's Hospital. So I thought that was great.
It makes me want to write some fan fiction in which Amy Leatheran has to assist Dr. Roberts and Dr. Christo, because I think she would have easily been a match for either of those extremely naughty doctors. Naughty in very different ways.
Yeah. I was going to say, I wouldn't wish that on her, but I think you're right, actually, Kemper. I think she'd be a great match for both of them.
I think she could handle them quite easily. And we even, we mentioned just that title of matron, which has such an old-fashioned ring to it. And I love that letter that Amy Leatheran is writing at the beginning of Murder in Mesopotamia to Sister Kershaw. It ends with, "Well, dear, I will close now. I thought what you told me about little Stubbins was simply killing. Whatever did matron say?" So, matron is like this. It's like the boss or the principal, the enforcer of order in the ward. And it's just such a great little detail.
Scary matron character.
Exactly, the scary matron character. Oh, and then you have also, Claire, a little Dickensian shout out that you wanted to make, and far be it from me to deny you that.
I just had to get it in there. We know Christie loved her Dickens, and so in Sad Cyprus, Roddy hears Nurse Hopkins on the stairs, and he tells Eleanor, "I heard Mrs. Gamp stumping up the stairs." And Mrs. Gamp is a nurse from Dickens' Martin Chuzzlewit, and she became this notorious stereotype of Victorian nurses before Nightingale's time. So this is before the influence of Nightingale. And Mrs. Gamp spends more time drinking gin than tending to her patients. She very much represents that Victorian woman from a lower class. She's poor, she has to earn her living. But of course, there were no nursing standards at that time, and anybody could call themselves a nurse. So if she wanted to spend that time drinking gin and not really doing nursing duties, then so be it. That was acceptable back then, but it is a very iconic image. So I love that was referenced in one of our nurse-heavy novels.
Yeah, and I love that there is a 19th century equivalent to probably, what we would use these days would be Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? At least in the U.S., Nurse Ratched is definitely a phrase that gets thrown around. And I love that there is, I remember Sari Gamp from Martin Chuzzlewit. I mean, she's a great comedian, one of Dickens's, great sort of larger than life comedic characters. And just, Christie often doesn't get the credit for being as nimble as she often was with some of those classic references. And it's a great subtle sort of reference there that just, I think, adds another layer to all of the nursing hijinks that are happening in that novel, which we will be exploring as we go through our top dozen nurses from the Christie canon. So it is finally time here on this episode to talk some specific nurses. And as we did in our doctors episode, we will be discussing some honorable mentions after we go through our dozen nurses. So Claire, could you start us off with number 12?
Absolutely. So we have to include our elusive male nurses here. So at number 12, we have Horbury from Hercule Poirot's Christmas. And we also have Arthur Jackson from A Caribbean Mystery. So Horbury, we actually don't know his first name, but he is one of our male nurse attendants. He is described as a dark man with a smooth face who creeps about the house like a cat, unsettling the other inhabitants of Gorston Hall, which seems to be why his employer, Simeon Lee, actually likes him. So I think it's also mentioned that male nurses are hard to come by, and I'm sure Simeon Lee's family do not want to upset the situation by getting rid of him. Simeon Lee actually seems to like him, and I'm sure would have probably scared off younger female nurses, and definitely not been a fan of the more stereotypical bossy, older matron type nurses. So I think this arrangement works really well in Hercule Poirot's Christmas. And then in A Caribbean Mystery, we have Arthur Jackson, who is described as a nurse attendant, masseur, and a valet for Jason Raphael. And we see him immediately through Miss Marple's eyes. He is described as tall and good looking in a white jacket. So both of these portrayals are of young, or at least youngish, and virile men. So that different from the younger, attractive female nurses that we often see. So definitely very worthy of being on our list here.
And yeah, I feel like, we talked about the stereotype of nursing work as women's work. And to me, it feels like these rare male nurses in Christie, there's almost a point being made about their virility and their strength, because it seems as though otherwise we might assume that something is off in that way. I always got that sense. And I also don't think that it's a coincidence that they are the male nurse attendants to two particularly difficult and cantankerous men, right? Simeon Lee and Jason Raphael. I mean, woof, they are handfuls, right? And so it's just, the gender politics of that is really fascinating to me, given this inherent bias that we have in terms of, nurses are usually women. And here we have, and they both really are, in the same way that there's a blurriness between a female social companion and a medical companion. They are, they're valets, they're valets. Like they really have an alternate title, but they're absolutely presented as also providing this kind of male nurse role. And it's just so fascinating to me that part of that portrayal has to be, oh yes, and they were, they're very strong because they have to do all this lifting and they have to, contend with these men who are just so opinionated. And it's just a really different sort of a portrayal from what we get with all of these women. And I find that fascinating.
It really is. And I have no doubt that both of those male nurses are earning every single penny that they are paid with those particular patients. So.
And in that, the elusive male nurse is a category, and I suppose we should really be awarding these spots to individuals. I would say that Arthur Jackson is the easy choice between the two, because he ends up playing quite a key role in the solving of the crime. Jackson is the one who looks into Molly's face cream and suggests the precise way that it's been contaminated so as to give Molly hallucinations. He's the brawn to Miss Marple's brains when it comes time to restrain our murderer, Tim Kendall. So in a way, he's heroic. And yet there's this sense that he isn't quite above board either, that he has a checkered past. So just a very interesting character. And in the same way that I had to call out the role of the nurse in the ableist trope of the malingerer, I do also have to call out the fact that both of these valet nurse characters are paired with men who are not just cantankerous as to personality, but who have limited mobility. Both Simeon Lee and Jason Raphael have serious health issues. They cannot get around easily on their own. And for this reason, they require lots of literal heavy lifting from these men. The same goes for Edwards in The Body in the Library, who is the valet to Conway Jefferson. Christie describes him as being in a wheeled chair. Edwards is never called a nurse, but he definitely provides the same sort of care for his employer. It seems to me as though Christie felt she had to pair these older, frailer men with strong, healthy ones who would help them around. Not that this is a necessarily ableist or problematic notion, but it is a particular one. And I think it harkens back to what Claire was talking about in terms of male nurses focusing on those areas where their physical strength would come into play on the job. Just an interesting distinction I did not notice till researching this episode.
What would you do if your online store converted 36% more shoppers? You could take 36% more vacation.
Another pina colada? Yes, please.
Open a new retail location with 36% more square feet.
Fantastic.
Hire 36% more help.
You're hired and you're hired.
Shopify has the world's best converting checkout, up to 36% better than other e-commerce platforms. What you do with those extra sales is up to you. Switch to Shopify today at shopify.com/listen and get a $1 trial. Shopify.com/listen.
I drive my bus in a busy city. That's why road safety is so important to me. I know that I must slow down and be extra careful when I make a wide turn. Buses need more room than cars. Everyone can help keep our roads safe. Next time you're driving, remember to give buses plenty of time and space to finish turning before driving ahead. Let's all plan to share the road safely. Learn how at www.sharetheroadsafely.gov.
All right, I will take number 11. And this is another category here. You know, we had the elusive male nurse in number 12. And in number 11, we are going to talk about fake/questionable nurses. Because as we mentioned, donning a nursing uniform is often very, very useful in Christie in terms of a disguise. But I had to pick one fake nurse to put in this spot. So I am choosing Nurse DeSarah from The Case of the Rich Woman, which is a short story within the Parker Pine collection. I think that Nurse DeSarah is the best fake nurse in the canon because I remember covering this story with Catherine Brobeck, the always missed Catherine Brobeck. And the instant that I read the words in the story, Nurse DeSarah, I just said, uh-oh, to myself. And Catherine said exactly the same thing. And we were laughing about that because Madeline DeSarah, by this point in that collection, has just shown herself to be ruthless in terms of doing whatever Parker Pine needs done. You know, she will do his bidding. And Madeline DeSarah in a nurse's uniform with a cup that she then asks our poor titular rich woman to drink at, Mrs. Reimer. We just sort of want to burst onto the scene and say, no, please don't do this. And we talked on our doctor's episode about how we have a fake doctor, the fake Dr. Constantine, as opposed to the real Dr. Constantine in that story as well. So I think that she's our best fake nurse, but there are so many others. And I would love if you could actually run through them, Claire.
So we do have lots of other fake nurses. In Destination Unknown, we have Helga Needheim. She wears a nurse's uniform to gain access to the facility, which again, I think speaks to being that authority figure and therefore being able to gain access. They came to Baghdad. Victoria Jones, actually, when she's trying to secure her passage to Baghdad, she says she is not exactly a nurse, but has a good deal of experience of nursing. So it's a little bit ambiguous what that actually means. Again, it's possible she's one of our characters that maybe did have a little bit of experience of nursing, or it could just be Victoria Jones purely trying to get out to Baghdad. Also in that same novel, we have Anna Shiel, and she left the University College Hospital in London dressed as a nurse. We also have another character named Catherine, who is also described as dressed as a nurse, but very much implied that she is not a real nurse. In N or M, we have Nurse Elton. So this is actually a parachutist who lands disguised in a nurse's uniform, which then Tuppence actually gets hold of and wears and passes herself off as Nurse Elton. And we have in the Partners in Crime series, in the man who was number 16, we have a character who dresses up as a nurse to get past Tommy and Tuppence and successfully does that. In The Man in the Brown Suit, Anne Bedingfeld claims that she knows a doctor isn't a real doctor. I know Kemper discussed this on our previous doctors episode. And she knows this because she has experience of working in hospitals and she's seen doctors handle bodies. Later, she confirms that during the First World War, she worked in a hospital dispensary. So initially I was curious if she'd only worked in a dispensary, how she could have possibly seen doctors handling bodies. But of course it is possible that just like Christie, she actually worked across departments and she may have done a bit of nursing there as well. So that is entirely plausible.
I love that, by the way. Sorry, I never caught that nuance, Claire. That's such a good catch that like she did both. And I think that's so, I completely believe that Christie was like, you know what, I'm just going to give her my backstory.
Absolutely. And it did make sense as more and more nurses were either going abroad to help out with the war. People really just had to pitch in wherever they were needed. So yeah, it's entirely possible. And then in Sad Cypress, we have Mary Gerard, who at the beginning of the novel expresses quite a few times that she is very interested in training as a nurse because she comes from a family of nurses, which we may discuss later. But actually, Mary does not go on to do her nurse training. She becomes a masseuse. Nurse Hopkins actually gives us some advice that there are more advantages in that as a career than nursing, such as having more money in it, being able to have the flexibility to move around, and your time is your own. So yes, those are our either questionable nurses or our fake nurses.
Yeah, that Nurse Hopkins seems to know an awful lot about monetary concerns and
she certainly does.
Interesting.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
All right, let's go now to our 10th nurse here. And this is actually a really interesting one. And I'd love if you could take this, Claire, because this relates directly, I think, to some of the issues that you were discussing when you talked about the changes in nursing over the course of the 20th century. Who do we have in our 10th spot?
So in 10th place, we have Miss Packard, who is the matron from Sunny Ridge Nursing Home in By the Pricking of My Thumbs. So she is very prominent in the beginning of this novel. She provides a good insight to Tommy and Tuppence and to what is going on in the nursing home. She talks about resident complaints, but she often ignores them or any kind of institutional blame for anything that could be amiss. So I found this kind of terrifying as well as interesting because we really start to learn how vulnerable the residents are. I mean, she seems very efficient. Tommy in particular, I think, is quite impressed with her. I think Tuppence, because of her nursing background, gets the sense that something is a little bit off and something isn't quite right. And maybe not all of the residents are that happy or comfortable, and maybe there's some mysterious going on happening. So Miss Packard is always there to greet Tommy and Tuppence and take them up to Aunt Ada. and to explain how they are. But certainly when anything is picked up on, like Mrs. Moody wanting her cocoa, a resident who is constantly swallowing a thimble, it's all just passed off as these people are elderly, they're very confused, you can't really rely on what they're saying. So I think what's kind of scary about that is we just have to take Miss Packard's word for it. She is the voice of authority as to what we should believe and should not believe, unless we're a more astute reader and we're starting to question things in the way that Tuppence does, particularly with Mrs. Lancaster when she's not there anymore, and residents seem to be dying fairly rapidly as well. And again, that's just put down to old age, and that's just what happens in this home. So I think she is really interesting, and I think even when Tommy and Tuppence visit the home and the door is often opened by what's usually described as a young girl in an overall, a nylon, we're starting to get that uniform that's institutionalized. Of course, we still have our nurses in their nurses' uniform, but we're really getting an insight now that we're in 1968 as to what this institutionalized care is looking like in England, and how we've gotten away from the old-fashioned nurse living in your home or you attending a hospital. This is what long-term care is now looking like. So yeah, that was a particularly interesting book.
It's really fascinating, and it makes me think of that novel in such a different way, because what it really boils down to is the failure of an institution, right? I mean,
right.
If Miss Packard, but what's fascinating about it is that the way that Miss Packard is depicted, I don't feel as though we're being asked to blame her. Because I think she's someone who does have a fair amount of competence, but she's overwhelmed. She's overwhelmed, and she just doesn't have the tools to really, properly manage everything. And what's also really interesting to me is that we have the scene with Mrs. Lancaster where she comes into the room as Tuppence is just waiting because she's sort of been dismissed, right, by Aunt Ada, and she just has to wait until Tommy is done. And we have that creepy thing of, was it your poor child in the fireplace with the glass of milk? And we know that scene happens 3 times within Christie's canon. And there's a little bit of fuzziness as to whether or not it's happening in a nursing home or basically a sanatorium, or dare I even say an asylum. But here it really is a nursing home. And a nursing home that, because we're so late in the canon, is much more in line with what we mean today in 2026 when we say nursing home, as opposed to in the novels in the 20s and 30s when they say nursing home. And all of that very modern and I think late 20th century understanding of that institution, and even depiction of that institution, which completely carries into, I think, our understanding today, goes to the heart of what's happening here, which is that she's slipping through the cracks and she's killing people and she's, engaging in all of this mayhem. And even someone like Miss Packard is just like powerless to really stop her. And this is why she's been able to do what she's doing. And, I think so often in Christie, we have to play that game of like, okay, well, let's contextualize it historically so that we can understand how this is all functioning. This is one instance where she was with the times, and the way that I think she's sort of portraying and using the institution of a nursing home is very modern day. There's no translation that needs to happen. I get it. And it's sort of why Catherine and we joked about this, but when we covered that novel, we were substituting the name of the nursing home in the Golden Girls. The Golden Girls sitcom, Shady Pines, which is where, Sophia escapes from basically in the pilot of that show. Because it's kind of the same thing, and that's just really interesting to me. I just never thought about it in that way. So this is why I love doing these episodes.
Yes, and I think what is so interesting, I talked earlier about how standards had improved in the 60s and the 70s, and there was much more accountability. But at the end of the book, when Tuppence actually asks Mrs. Lancaster, how did you get the morphine? She said, oh, that was quite easy. A man I lived with years ago, he had cancer. The doctor gave me supplies for him to keep in my charge. Other drugs too. I said later they'd all been thrown away, but I kept them, and other drugs and sedatives too. I thought they might come in useful someday, and they did. I've still got a supply. And so what's so amazing is how did, even if she has this supply, how does she get them into a nursing home when, typically residents don't come with a whole lot of belongings, and yet somehow she has smuggled in these lethal drugs. So, I mean, that's, really quite scary at that time, that things were supposedly getting a lot better.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, now for something much, much earlier, which also I think really relates directly to all of that great historical research that you did into the way that nursing was changing over the course of the 20th century. Let's talk about our number 9 pick, who is Nurse Craven from Curtin. So I already mentioned the neglected Dr. Franklin at the top of this episode. We are not going to neglect Curtin in this episode. And as I mentioned, Curtin was written around the beginning of World War II, and Nurse Craven really is a pre-NHS nurse, right? I'd love for you to actually just cover this one as well, Claire, because you're just much more well-versed in this than I.
Sure. Yeah. So this is an interesting one because we know that Curtin was written around the very beginning of the Second World War, but not actually published until 1975. So, of course, Nurse Craven is written in that very much that pre-NHS typical traditional nurse style. But when it was actually published in 1975, nursing had changed significantly. So what would have been more commonplace was actually Miss Packard, we were just talking about, and that kind of nurse. So that's interesting. But I think at this time, a live-in nurse was still very much possible by 1975, very much only for wealthy families, because it would be more likely in the case of Mrs. Franklin that she would actually have a district nurse that would call on her at home if needed. So I think really the purpose of Nurse Craven is to have an independent medical practitioner other than Dr. Franklin, because of course Dr. Franklin is Mrs. Franklin's husband. So we almost need an impartial person to verify whether there is actually anything wrong with Mrs. Franklin or not. And that question kind of hovers over this book. And what's interesting is Nurse Craven isn't going to cross that professional line and say, I don't think there's anything wrong with her. She remains very much professional and neutral on that subject. And she does imply that, yes, she does need nursing care. So I think what's useful about having Nurse Craven in Curtin is that she potentially could be on our suspect list because we know that she's been involved with a poisoning case before. She's had to give evidence in court, and she says that she's never forgotten that. And so straight away, we've got a bit of a backstory there. We could think potentially, does that mean that she's poisoned someone, or was she just involved in some way? We know, as with the doctors, nurses absolutely have the means and the opportunity. She does have medication, which she can access. So that's kind of interesting. We might possibly suspect her. What I also found interesting upon studying Nurse Craven is how she's actually pitied by a lot of the characters, especially Hastings and Sir Carrington, because her jobs often involve fetching and carrying things for Mrs. Franklin. So it's really implied here that there are minimal nursing tasks that she's doing, and her medical knowledge is not really being utilised to its true effect here. It's almost like she's doing more domestic servant type tasks. There's actually a point where she's asked to go and get a pack of cards so that the group can play cards. She's often, as I say, fetching and carrying things. And it's described that her hands are long and white, very different to the hands of so many hospital nurses. So that's another indication that her job is much easier than working in a hospital and doing long hours and heavy lifting and constantly getting her hands dirty and really being, hands-on in a practical type of manner. So it's just interesting that she's pitied for that. And Hastings and Carrington actually talk about how, she deserved a better fate, really. She's only a young girl. She should have done something better than just end up here. But actually, I think it's entirely possible she's actually having a good time, because we learn later from Poirot at the end in his postscript, he describes Nurse Craven as an attractive young woman with a keen eye for men who had a try at Dr. Franklin, unsuccessfully, hence her dislike for Judith Hastings. Then she's described as carrying on with Allerton and then casting her eye on Sir William Boyd Carrington. And so actually Nurse Craven has her accommodation and meals provided because she is a live-in nurse. She has a built-in social life. She's often chatting to the group who are staying there. And so you have to kind of wonder, is she actually, despite being pitied as not achieving her potential, is she having a really great time and just kind of chilling in this job and eyeing up the men? And actually, it sounds pretty good. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting observation.
I think there are layers to Nurse Craven for sure. And let's just take a second look at her name, Nurse Craven. I think sometimes Christie is playing around with expectations, as our listener noted with Dr. Shepard. It's a nice sounding name for an incredibly evil man, but Nurse Craven as a little bit more of a minor character. Is she perhaps a bit craven, right? That she's using this as an entree into opportunities to kind of raise herself up, not in a strictly professional or above board way. I absolutely think that, we're getting anything that Poirot says is to be listened to, because we know that he is an excellent observer and that, he has this sort of insight into people, as ridiculous as some of his foibles can be. So yeah, there's really a lot going on actually with this character. And I especially love the dissonance, I think, between her role, which would have made a lot of sense when the book was written in 1940 versus the state of affairs when the book came out in 1975. That's really fascinating that she's a little bit of this relic from a different time, and she's kind of out of place, which is fine because we know that the book is not, unlike Sleeping Murder, where we're really not sure, when it is or what's happening. It feels like even though we had all of those Poirots that survived the 40s and into the 50s and 60s, we kind of just have to let the chronological concerns go for a lot of different reasons when we read Curtain. But this is one of the more interesting chronological concerns. So I love that we're highlighting that. Okay, let's move on to number 8. And this is one of our sunniest nurses here on this list, because we do have to, with all of the evil medical people of Agatha Christie, who we love to hate, we do have to occasionally sometimes give the good characters their due. And this is from a novel that we also don't shout out nearly enough on this podcast. From Dumb Witness, we have Nurse Carruthers, who is just an excellent nurse. I mean, she is a really shining example of how a nurse should be. She is kind and sensible and empathetic. She knows when to be hands off with a patient. I mean, I think there is a lot as to intuition that a good nurse is supposed to bring to her relationship with her patient. So she knows when to interfere and she knows when not to. She's not a fussy nurse. She is just a nurse who is there to help, whatever that means. And I think she can be flexible and adapt herself to different situations. And then this is an example where even though we will have another nurse who is a much more active and robust sidekick sort of a character to Monsieur Poirot, here in another Poirot novel, we do have a nurse who helps Poirot in some significant ways with character observations, because nurses are such good observers. She also describes Emily Arundel, who Poirot never meets. Like, let's always remember the American title of this novel. Poirot loses a client because he gets the letter, and then by the time he actually gets to see what's going on, his client has died and has in fact been murdered. And of course, and perhaps this is the most important endorsement, Bob, the terrier. Bob and Nurse Carruthers, I think they have a real understanding for each other.
Yes.
That is high praise from their creator, Agatha Christie. I really like Nurse Carruthers. How about you?
Yeah. I really like her too. And of course, gotta love Bob as well. How could you not love Bob? So it's good that they have a good friendship too.
All right. I'm very excited actually about our number 7 nurse. Take it away, Claire.
So at number 7, we have Jennifer Fortescue from A Pocket Full of Rye, also known as Mrs. Val and Ruby Mackenzie. So Jennifer Fortescue was a nurse when she met Percival. She actually nursed him through pneumonia. Rex Fortescue looked down on her as not good enough for his son, so kind of too lowly there. So she's actually the daughter of a former partner of Rex's who he left to die in Africa. So her mother, Helen Mackenzie, believed that Rex was responsible for the death of her husband and made her children therefore swear that they would avenge his death by killing Rex. However, when Jennifer became a nurse, she realized that her mother's mental balance was off, and she thinks that a much better form of revenge would actually be to marry Rex's son, because then she could nurse him so badly that he wouldn't survive. However, through her nurse training, she realizes and later admits that if you are a nurse by profession, you just simply cannot do that kind of thing. So when he pulls through and asks her to marry him, she accepts, because she also realizes at that point a better form of revenge would be to get the money back that Rex Fortescue swindled from her father. So I think she's a really good suspect in that novel because there's so much going on. And I think, as you said, Kemper, she's kind of our best red herring nurse character, because she's up to quite a lot here. So there's so much going on. We definitely suspect her. And of course, she's put blackbirds on in the pie on the central murder victim Rex Fortescue's desk. So she's certainly a busy lady.
Yeah, it's two separate blackbirds incidents. She puts I think 4 blackbirds on his desk, and then she also puts them into that pie so that she's sort of playing around with the nursery rhyme. And that's a huge obfuscation, because it seems like, well, whoever did that has to be the murderer, but in fact, she and her watered down plot coming from her mother Helen has absolutely nothing to do with the truly devious plot that is taking place here and that resulted in the murder of the patriarch of Rex Fortescue. And I really love this because, her nursing is evidence of her inherent goodness in a way.
Yes.
I think in a book that has so much sourness to it, and I don't mean that as a criticism, because I do really love A Pocket Full of Rye. I mean, I love the avenging fury of Miss Marple, and she's so angry that her maid has been, treated so horribly, not only been murdered, but had the clothespin put on her nose, and she, enters the scene and is just furious, literally furious as a fury who's come here to seek vengeance, and boy, does she get her vengeance. And, the murderer here, Lance Fortescue, is probably, I think, one of the most reprehensible murderers in all of the canon. And just by contrast, what Jennifer does here, even though not great, she first went into a nursing position with the intention of killing her patient. She then married him under false pretenses. She certainly was not real with him at that point, but ultimately a good egg. Right? Mrs. Val is okay, especially compared to, the nightmare disasters that are littered about this family. So I think here too, we can just see Christie's regard for nurses and the nursing profession. And I really love that.
Yeah, me too. I mean, without the nurse training, she might not have realized that her mother's mental health has been affected, and she may not have followed that path at all. Her life could have been very different. And it's so really thanks to that nurse training that it turned out that way.
Yeah, she's just got a good head on her shoulders. And I think, because she's a nurse and that it's part of her character, and it really brings her through successfully a book where there are a lot of really awful people doing really awful things. And some people, like poor Gladys, who just didn't have the same smarts and wherewithal, she doesn't survive. And Jennifer is able to, seemingly have an okay life, actually, and get through all of this. So yeah, I just really appreciated, I think, lifting Jennifer Fortescue out of the morass of A Pocket Full of Rye as a nurse. I just think that's really illuminating as to Christie's stance toward nurses, and it helps us see this novel in a slightly different way. So love Jennifer Fortescue. All right, Claire, let's talk about a slightly less sunny nurse from the canon. I believe that now, let's see, we have, because we are at number 6, right?
Right.
So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, so we have 6 more nurses to go. And with one exception, we are in dark territory here. So take us to the dark side with our 6th nurse, please.
Okay, I will take you over to the dark side. It is Kirsten Lindstrom from Ordeal by Innocence. So she is actually described as selfless and efficient and loyal to the family, But we later learn she's actually so loyal to the family because she's driven by jealousy. So she's kind of a powerful character. She is scary at times, yet also in her way, a very small and pathetic character, particularly the way that she's in love with Jacko and kind of falls for the younger man and kind of all the things that he's telling her. And I know, Kemper, you drew a comparison with Zachariah Osborne in The Pale Horse.
Yes, because I think that I pity both of them in the same way because they have this smallness of character, and yet I am terrified by them. And really, because of that smallness, I'm terrified by them because they sort of, have this ability to do horrible things. And yeah, I mean, my one issue with Kirsten Lindstrom, and Catherine and I discussed this when we covered Ordeal by Innocence, is that this is the rare Christie that upon my reread for the podcast, I expected to like more than I did. And one of the reasons I didn't love it as much as I thought I would is that I didn't find her characterization to be quite as convincing, certainly as Zachariah Osborne's, but, to be as convincing as many other characters and many other murderers within Christie. I felt like there was a lot about her that was being veiled because she was the murderer, so that I never really got to know her. I know that's a controversial opinion. There are many of you out there who just don't have that same issue and who have written to me about it. And fair enough. But I already, listeners, knocked Kirsten Lindstrom down several rungs on this list. Claire had her a little bit higher. I probably would have even put her below Jennifer Fortescue, who I really love. But I think putting her on this list, though, is absolutely fair because she's a really important nurse murderer within the canon.
Yeah, I'm actually wondering now whether she should have gone below Jennifer Fortescue. I think because although she is kind of powerful, scary, pathetic in her own way, I did find with Kirsten, she's not as memorable. I mean, kind of going through the text, like there are things that you think, oh yes, I remember she's the murderer. I remember why, but I don't feel like we learn a whole lot about her character and backstory. And maybe that's intentional, but she's perhaps not as memorable as some of our other nurse characters.
Yeah, I just feel like it's a trap that so many mystery writers fall into, that they don't divulge all that much about who their murderer character actually is because they are the murderer and they can't, and they feel like their hands are tied. And it's remarkable to me how rarely Agatha Christie fell into that trap and managed to pull the wool over our eyes and get that reveal where you're like, oh my God, I didn't see that coming. But also not to feel like, oh, but I had no idea who that person even was because you barely told me anything. And I'm not even being fair because it's not a 10 out of 10 version of that in Ordeal by Innocence. But I just remember feeling a little bit that way. And it's so rare for me to feel that way in a Christie. And also, I mean, I'll be honest with you, Claire, I didn't even remember that Kirsten was a nurse, actually.
Yes.
I probably would have said that she was like a companion-ish sort of a character, but
I was the same. Yeah, I kind of had to look further and then think like, and even when it said that she had this nursing background, I still had to kind of double check, but what do we mean by nursing background? Was she actually a nurse? And then, yeah, because again, in this capacity, she's not really nursing, she is more like a companion. So
yeah, one of these like maybe nurse masseuses, right? Like those two pursuits do sometimes get conflated a bit in Christie. We mentioned Mary Gerard, and I think we'll be talking about one other nurse / masseuse a little bit later in our honorable mentions. But yeah, I mean, so it's definitely, she's definitely there. Like she's definitely a nurse and a murderer within a really solid book within Christie, which is why she earns her spot on this list. But I'm not super excited. I'm not as excited about her as I am.
Maybe we should have put her as number 7.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. Let the evil Kirsten reign at number 6.
Place.
What would you do if your online store converted 36% more shoppers? You could take 36% more vacation.
Another pina colada? Yes, please.
Open a new retail location with 36% more square feet.
Fantastic.
Hire 36% more help.
You're hired and you're hired.
Shopify has the world's best converting checkout, up to 36% better than other e-commerce platforms. What you do with those extra sales is up to you. Switch to Shopify today at shopify.com/listen and get a $1 trial. Shopify.com/listen.
I drive my bus in a busy city. That's why road safety is so important to me. I know that I must slow down and be extra careful when I make a wide turn. Buses need more room than cars. Everyone can help keep our roads safe. Next time you're driving, Remember to give buses plenty of time and space to finish turning before driving ahead. Let's all plan to share the road safely. Learn how at www.sharetheroadsafely.gov.
All right, well, let's talk about our fifth nurse here on this list. We've got another nurse murderer from a short story this time, and this short story is within the Labors of Hercules. This is the Lernaean Hydra, and the nurse in question is Nurse Harrison. And this is a story that we actually mentioned on our doctors episode, because here we have a nurse who is in love with a doctor. And because she is in love with this doctor who is himself in love with someone else, she is at first motivated simply by, wanting to be with him, and then by jealousy and wanting to essentially frame this doctor and the woman he actually loves for the murder that she has committed. It's a fairly pointless murder because she doesn't realize the fact that this doctor is in love with that other woman until she commits the murder. So it's a little bit like a dual motive. There's a lot going on within this story for a short story, because she initially says, okay, I'm going to take out the wife so that I can, reel in the husband for myself. And she does so by way of arsenic poisoning. This goes to Access. The doctor husband kept a poison cupboard, and everyone assumes that his dispenser, who just so happens to be the woman he's in love with, is the one who must have taken some of the arsenic in it and given it to his wife. But it was just as easy for Nurse Harrison to access that cupboard as well. And of course, she has unparalleled access to the victim herself, who is her patient. But after the murder takes place, she then realizes, oh no, he's not in love with me. He's not interested in me at all. He's interested in this other woman. And she's all too happy for that other woman and for the doctor to receive all the suspicion of the town, which is the titular Lernaean Hydra of gossip, for everyone to believe that they in fact murdered the doctor's wife. It's a horrible, horrible dereliction of duty, isn't it?
Absolutely. Very pointless.
Yeah. And I just have to point out that Nurse Harrison is a nurse who pushes a bit against the boundaries that Claire picked up on when it comes to murderous nurses. She is not young. When we first meet her, she is described as still a handsome woman nearing 40. Still attractive in her late 30s? Imagine that. So Claire is absolutely right that the young nurses are never the murderous nurses in Christie. But we're also told that she had the calm, serene features of a Madonna with big, sympathetic, dark eyes. Yes, ye old Madonna description. It's been a while since we've mentioned one of those. And at the end of the story, she's described as a gentle, womanly creature who Poirot says would have made probably a good wife and mother. Her emotions were just a little too strong for her. So this is a far cry from the older, stern nurse figure, which we will definitely be seeing a bit more of in just a moment. I thought it was worth pointing that out. And my final note on this story is that it features a character named, wait for it, Miss Leatherin. Given that we will be talking about a very important nurse character who goes by that name and who appears in 1936's Murder in Mesopotamia. As a reminder, the Lernaean Hydra was first serialized in 1939. I wonder if Christie simply had nurses on the brain when she was casting around for a last name for this village busybody character. Or maybe Nurse Leatherin has a maiden aunt who lives in Market Loughborough in Berkshire. All right, so Claire, who do we have in our fourth spot, just shy of placing on the medal's podium within our Nurses of Agatha Christie?
So in our fourth spot, we have Evelyn Howard from The Mysterious Affair at Styles. So talking of nurses that you actually forget are nurses.
Okay, good. I'm glad you said that, because this one too, I was like, oh, right, she was a nurse? Okay.
So this was so fascinating to me because, again, I had to kind of double check, was she a nurse? And actually, if you Google Evelyn Howard from The Mysterious Affair at Styles or Evelyn Howard Agatha Christie, you will find tons of articles that say she's not a nurse, she's a companion, but it clearly says in the text that she is a nurse. And it even references the hospital she's working at. So she very much is a nurse. But I find that amazing that 100 years later, there's still confusion about whether she actually is a nurse or not. And I think that's completely deliberate. I think she is unscrupulous, she's devious, she's very intelligent. And if Christie had kept pointing to her being a nurse, we probably would have suspected that she could be the murderer. And so I think the whole nursing background, we're just very simply told that. a few times, but it's very kind of vague and dismissive. And I think that's so that we don't actually suspect her, particularly because we have Cynthia, who is working as a VAD dispenser, so very similar to Christie's own background. We have Lawrence Cavendish, who is a qualified doctor, but not a practicing doctor. And we have Dr. Bauerstein. And so we have three other medical professionals who we can all suspect, particularly because this was such a clever murder that really needed scientific knowledge, particularly around chemistry. So it's far more likely that Cynthia would have had that knowledge than Evie Howard. But actually, again, this was something I was so curious about when researching, would a nurse at this time have known how to use the strychnine and the bromide to potentially use those substances as a murder weapon? And she absolutely would have done through her nurse training. So that's why I referenced earlier that the materia medica, she wouldn't have had advanced chemistry knowledge, but nurses were certainly explained and taught about different medicines, which ones were compatible and which ones were not, and how dangerous it could have been to mix certain medications together. So it's completely plausible that Evelyn Howard would have known this and would have been able to do that experiment in the way that she did. But I think this is just a book that is so full of misdirection. I think it is so cleverly done, particularly for Christie's first novel. So I think it's entirely realistic that we would forget that Evie Howard actually was a nurse.
I love that. The book is so brilliant that it's still fooling us.
Yes.
I completely agree with you because it's true. The fact that she's a nurse is crucial, towards selling her ability to engage in this plot, because even though we have two murderers, she's the one who has the medical background. And this is such a scientific sort of a murder. I mean, it's one of the few Christies that you could argue requires specialized knowledge. And, you can tell that Christie was living within this medical environment when she wrote it, and she was doing all of her dispensing work. But it's hugely important that Evie Howard be a nurse and have that medical background. And I love that she's so subtle about it that we just forget it when we're thinking of the novel. And I'm shocked that AI, when queried, could possibly give you an incorrect answer about that. But,
shocking that AI would be accurate. But it's also really interesting at the end of the book that Poirot explains that Evelyn Howard's father was a doctor, and so it's possible she may have helped to make up medications for him and therefore gained the knowledge through working informally for her father with medication, or that the book that's called The Art of Dispensing, our attention is drawn to the fact that Cynthia has left that lying around the house. So potentially anybody could have picked up that book and learned the details about combining these substances and what happens. So I think it's interesting that even at the end we're given additional information as to why Evie may have been able to do this, whereas in reality, probably her nurse training would have been sufficient. But I think there's no doubt that Christie's experience working in a dispensary is what truly gave her the knowledge, and she may well have studied from the book of the Art of Dispensing. I think it's, and so that's why I think it's far more likely that Cynthia would be the murderer. And that's what we're supposed to think. So that's just so interesting.
Yeah, and everything about the puzzle in The Mysterious Affair at Styles is extremely thorough and maximalist in a way that I think she soon grew out of. And, the one thing about The Mysterious Affair at Styles that is not like what a traditional, quote unquote, Agatha Christie puzzle would become like is its lightness of touch, because it doesn't have much lightness of touch. And you can tell this is a writer who is just starting out saying, I need to make sure that I dot every I and cross every T and make this plausible and don't have any loose ends. And she figured out ways to do that, I think, later in her career, even just a couple of years later, that were much simpler and straightforward and elegant. And we don't quite have that here. And I think you can see that with this, where it's like, well, she had the books and she had the father who was a doctor. Oh, and she also was a nurse. And, so there's a lot. But this is Agatha Christie on her journey to becoming Agatha Christie. So I think it's important to appreciate that. And it's so funny, Claire, but when I was going through this list and I was like, oh my God, you're right. She was a nurse. It made me think, for some reason, I don't know why, it made me think of Catherine Gray from The Mystery of the Blue Train, who, as you'll remember in the beginning of that novel, she comes into an inheritance from the woman who she was the companion to such a point where there's actually like a nasty letter that's written from the woman's relatives who are trying to bully her out of the inheritance and, pretend that they're going to create a scandal and claim that somehow she unduly influenced her. And I had this thought where I was like, was Catherine Gray also a nurse? and I looked it up, and she's not. I mean, she really was just a social companion to that older woman, to Mrs. Harfield, but it's because she doesn't need to be. There was no funny business going on. So it's sort of it's the sunny flip side, or it's even like what Evie Howard wanted to have happened, right? Which was to be friends with, the companion to this old woman who then leaves you all of her money so that you can go on a fabulous trip on the Blue Train and get involved in more murderous adventures. But anyway, yeah, really, really interesting. All of the layers to these early Christies, and in particular to the Mysterious Affair Styles. All right, well, we now are down to our top three. So let's talk about our bronze medalist here, who is another nurse from a short story. I do think that Nurse Harrison from the Lernaean Hydra did earn her place, but this is a much more devious and I think interesting nurse from a Christie short story, and that is Nurse Copling from The Blue Geranium. And this is just a really, really clever story with a nurse murderer, because the means of murder are just so very scientific. This isn't just, oh, I'm a nurse, so I have access to a vial of morphine or arsenic in the poison cupboard and or a hypodermic needle. This is a nurse who is using litmus paper and putting it over red flowers on wallpaper, and then knowing that the ammonia from smelling salts is going to react with the litmus paper as a base and turn it blue, and at the same time seed the idea that seeing these blue flowers seemingly magically appear is going to portend death, and seeding that idea into her superstitious patient who she is in fact going to kill. That is a really, really brilliant form of access in a medical professional. And I am just in awe, in a bad way, of Nurse Copling.
Yeah, the science and in the way that this is done, it's just so different from anything else that's been written before. So I think it's really impressive, because again, you need some medical knowledge to be able to pull this off. And it's so manipulative, the way she's trying to make her poor patient feel that she's absolutely losing her mind and going insane. So this is just so different.
And it's also, Nurse Copling is another nurse who has fallen in love with someone who she shouldn't have fallen in love with, right? In this case, it is her patient's husband. And I think they're both nurses, i.e. Nurse Harrison from the Lernaean Hydra and Nurse Copling from this story, The Blue Geranium, who are just violating their professional duties and taking matters into their own hands to get the man who they want. And they're justly punished for it. And I think, you can feel that this is just a dreadful, dreadful violation of duty, because they are such trusted figures and they do so wrong by their patients. The notion that they're killing their patients for their own personal gain is just really, really abhorrent, and is presented that way in the short stories. Like, we're meant to be, I think, really and truly chilled and horrified by these nurses. Do you think that's fair?
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree.
It makes me, it's very much like the chilling doctor murderers who also, just violate their standard of care and all of the duties and their professional code of conduct. Although if I had to say anything in Nurse Copling's favor, it's that dressing up as a fortune teller in the name of love is something I can't completely condemn, given that Mr. Rochester does the same thing in Jane Eyre. I can't remember if I made that comparison when Catherine and I covered this story, but I'd be shocked if I didn't. Impossible not to think about Mr. Rochester when Nurse Copling dresses up as Zarita, psychic reader of the future, though her purpose of seeding that superstitious belief in her victim is a bit different from Mr. Rochester's. Anyway, it doesn't take away from the dreadful conduct of this nurse, who is specified in the text as being an older woman. Ding, ding, ding. She is a very bad nurse indeed, and her conduct is just as bad as any of the other murderous doctors and nurses Claire and I have already covered. And perhaps that is an excellent segue to our silver medalist. Who is our number 2 nurse, Claire?
Our number 2 nurse is Jessie Hopkins from Sad Cypress. So where to start with Jessie Hopkins?
Oh, where to start?
She is a very interesting character. So, we start off with very much the impression that she's, again, one of those classic Christie middle-aged, competent nurses. She's homely. She's described as sensible. And then we start to realize maybe she's not so competent. She's lost a tube of morphine. And, maybe we should be thinking it's a little bit odd, because something I was really curious about was how the murder is done in a very medically and scientifically accurate way. It's very clever. Again, it's another murder that you would have to have medical knowledge to do this. So to inject yourself with morphine and then inject yourself with apomorphine, which is an emetic, which will make you vomit, to basically save yourself from being poisoned. I mean, again, this is not an average everyday murder at all. So I think that part was really well done. What I thought was really interesting with Jessie Hopkins is that she actually, during this time, so this book was written again just before the start of the Second World War, and due to the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920, it was a very, very serious offence to lose morphine. And what makes it even worse in Nurse Hopkins' case is that she doesn't even report it through the official channels that she's lost it. She really doesn't seem to worry too much about it. And it's also a bit odd that Dr. Lord and Nurse O'Brien also don't really seem to care. And when they're actually in the cafe and Nurse O'Brien and Nurse Hopkins are talking about it, Nurse O'Brien tells her not to worry, and Nurse Hopkins replies, "I'm not worrying." In reality, at this time, it was a very serious offence, and there would have been a formal investigation, possibly with police involvement. And if it was suspected that Nurse Hopkins was misusing the morphine in any way, either using it herself or selling it on, then the police would have been likely to have been involved in a criminal investigation. And certainly at this time, Nurse Hopkins would probably have been struck off the nursing register, and her career would have effectively been over. And even today, this would still be a very serious offence. So maybe in a very subtle way, the fact that she doesn't care about it is actually a small clue, because of course she doesn't care, because she thinks she's about to come into a fortune and inherit all of this money. And so why would she care if she never has to nurse again? So I thought that was kind of interesting. I think there's this real misuse of and a betrayal of trust of her nursing position here. And of course, we know that she's very greedy and that her motive is to inherit.
Yeah, I love that historical context that you gave, because I did not appreciate that any of the times that I read the novel, that it's so odd that she's not more upset about losing that morphine, which I think is a great tell as to what's really going on here. Sad Cypress is a wonderful novel in so many ways. I think there are aspects of the puzzle that are a little messy. The really serious one is the fact that when Nurse Hopkins serves that poisoned tea to Mary Gerard and herself, sure, she has taken care of, being able to then give herself the quote unquote antidote, which makes her vomit. But we're never at least told that she knows for sure that Eleanor Carlisle is not going to drink that tea as well. And given that Eleanor Carlisle is our main red herring suspect, the one who Nurse Hopkins is constantly trying to pin the murder of Mary Gerard on, that would have been a big old problem if Eleanor Carlisle had also died as a result of the tea, because then everyone would have figured it out much more quickly. And so, we needed one line of Eleanor saying, "I hate tea," or something like that. "I never drink tea." to clear that up. So that feels like a little bit of a hole. And perhaps you've identified another one, which is that fair enough that Nurse Hopkins is more than happy to brush the missing morphine under the rug. And of course, that's because she's the one who used it in, the first murder here within the story. She's murdered a whole bunch in the past as well, as we end up discovering. But why are Dr. Lord and Nurse O'Brien also not that perturbed about this? They really should be.
Right. I mean, it's entirely possible that even if Nurse Hopkins was found to be innocent and maybe she really just through carelessness mislaid the morphine, Dr. Lord is probably never going to trust her again with medication. And remembering this is a small community where everybody knows everybody. So she needs a good reputation in this community. And we know she's nursing other patients. That's actually why she has morphine in her possession in the first place. I mean, obviously, I think Laura Wellman does have morphine, but she clearly says there's another patient in the community with a sarcoma who needs morphine twice a day. So it's very unlikely that she would have been trusted in that community again, which would have been detrimental to her career. So it is very odd that it's all downplayed. Of course, we know why, because Christie needs to keep Nurse Hopkins in the story. So it wouldn't do to have her struck off the register and out of the picture. She very much needs to be in the story. But I also found, and I'm probably nitpicking a little bit here, but I did find it a little bit odd after they've had their tea and sandwiches that Eleanor actually offers to help with the washing up, and Nurse Hopkins says, "Oh, I'm doing the washing up," and Eleanor says, "Okay, well then I'll dry up the tea things." And again, we know why that happens, because Eleanor needs to witness the puncture wound in Nurse Hopkins' wrist to pass that information on. But it's very unlikely that a lady of Eleanor's class would be in the kitchen making tea, washing up, drying up. Far more likely that Nurse Hopkins would have just done it on her own, or maybe Mary Gerard it would have been more plausible that she would have helped, although we're not going to hold that against her because she's just been poisoned. So she's slipping into a morphine coma at this point.
Yeah.
But
she's busy.
She's got things going on. So it is a little bit odd, because even after the washing up and the drying up, they then go upstairs and Nurse Hopkins is helping Eleanor to clear out Aunt Laura's things. And that is something that would have been much more convincing, although all the domestic staff have gone at this point. It's really unusual to have a medically qualified nurse doing domestic type tasks, such as clearing out the things of the deceased person. I mean, it is possible as a district nurse that, just because there's been a death in the family, it doesn't necessarily mean the nurse is going to cut the family loose and not call in on them and see how they're doing. So I think it's okay that she's there, but she seems to be around an awful lot, considering that Nurse O'Brien has now left and moved on to another patient. And we know that through the letters that she exchanges with Nurse Hopkins. And all the domestic staff have gone. It just seems a little bit odd that a district nurse would be there. But remembering this is pre-NHS era, so somebody is having to pay for her time and she's having to account for her time. So there was just something that didn't quite ring true about that. As I say, I'm probably nitpicking because we know Nurse Hopkins needs to be around to carry out the murder, but there were just a few plot holes there that didn't quite add up.
Yeah, no, and I think that is unique to Sad Cypress. There are just a couple of holes that we can poke in it. And yet, the characterization and the puzzle, as flawed as it is, it's so clever and it's so satisfying when we get to the end. And also, I do love, for our purposes, that one of the biggest clues, which we alluded to earlier in the episode, is that Mary Gerard had a lot of nurses in her family. And her aunt was a nurse. And lo and behold, her aunt is Nurse Hopkins. And, that's the whole thing. That's the whole show. And it's, I defy even the most astute reader to get there. I'm sure someone out there has, but I was just totally floored, when we get to the end and we have those two witnesses, one of whom is named Amelia Sedley. Speaking of classic references, I mean, that's just like a very bald-faced Vanity Fair Thackeray reference. Christie loves referencing Thackeray sometimes just as much as Dickens. But yeah, it's down to the nurses. This is certainly, the reason why Nurse Hopkins, I think, earns her place as a silver medalist here is that there's no forgetting that she's a nurse, and she is the murderer in a full-length novel of Agatha Christie's. This is not a Kirsten Lindstrom or an Evie Howard situation where you're like, oh, right, she's also a nurse. She's
definitely a nurse.
Yeah, she is identified as a nurse, and the fact that she is a nurse through and through is how she pulled off the murder. And there's just a lot to her, and she talks so much in this book, too. There's so much chatter from Nurse Hopkins, and she's so clever about what she's telling and what she's concealing and what she seems like she wants to conceal, but is actually, making sure that the characters know. And she's really a master manipulator. And even though we have, I think, a little bit of that clumsiness in the puzzle, it's not Nurse Hopkins' fault. It's Christie's fault.
I was very curious about that because she definitely, we know she's calculating. We know she's carried out murders before. She is very clever in planning this whole thing, and she's very clever in making Mary make a will. She definitely sets out to achieve her goal, and for the most part does achieve her goals. But it's interesting how she is portrayed, just the way, like you say, she talks a lot. Some of the things she says and the way she says them, she's kind of portrayed as that lower middle class nurse. So she doesn't come across as quite the most elegant or the brightest of characters. I think there's one chapter where she opens the door and she's got a bath bun in her mouth. So she's just kind of opening the door with her mouth full. She's always kind of drinking tea, spends a lot of time socializing as well. And so it really got me thinking, is that part of the act? Because we know she is clever, but she doesn't really come across that way. But then could you argue that, poisoning yourself, it's either very brave or really not very clever at all, because if that had gone wrong, she wouldn't have been successful. And obviously, ultimately, she isn't successful in the end, thanks to Poirot. But if she didn't have, for whatever reason, that opportunity to go into the kitchen and inject herself with apomorphine so she could vomit, if somebody had got in her way or something had distracted her, she could have ended up that she would have been killed as well. And it reminded me a lot of Simon Doyle in Death on the Nile, because I think he's our only other character that actually goes as far as potentially killing himself had that gone wrong when he shot himself in the leg, that it really could have gone so horribly wrong. And we know that he's not portrayed as the brightest of characters either. And very much Jackie is the brains behind their operation, whereas with Nurse Hopkins, she's the brains behind it. But I just think it's interesting because with our doctor murderers, often they're more sophisticated in the way they carry out their murder. And I think what Simon Doyle and Jessie Hopkins have in common is that neither of them can think of a better way to carry out the murder than to risk killing themselves. So I just thought that was an interesting comparison.
It's a very interesting comparison because, the key difference is, it's all Nurse Hopkins, right? And I think to a certain extent, she's leaning into the impression that she knows she's giving to other people. And she's almost begging people around her to dismiss her and think, oh, this is just, a lowly nurse. But then there's all of these machinations happening behind the scenes. And it's just, she's such a fascinating character. Just fantastic.
What would you do if your online store converted 36% more shoppers? You could take 36% more vacation.
Another pina colada? Yes, please.
Open a new retail location with 36% more square feet.
Fantastic.
Hire 36% more help.
You're hired and you're hired.
Shopify has the world's best converting checkout, up to 36% better than other e-commerce platforms. What you do with those extra sales is up to you. Switch to Shopify today at shopify.com/listen and get a $1 trial. Shopify.com/listen.
If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now everything's on sale during our Memorial Day event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses for a limited time. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number, to a good night's sleep.
All right. Well, we are now ready to crown our top nurse in the canon. And I think many of you probably know what direction we are headed in here. I'm thrilled that we are able to end, for once, Claire, on a slightly sunnier note, because we are not ending on a murderer. Oh, no. Our top-ranked nurse in the works of Agatha Christie is none other than Amy Leatherin from Murder in Mesopotamia and Passenger to Frankfurt. So I will be honest, Amy Leatherin is one of my favorite characters in all of Christie. I absolutely adore Amy Leatherin because there are certain first-person narrators of Agatha Christie's that to me are just magical. I love Amy Leatherin as much as I love Leonard Clement in The Murder at the Vicarage. And that's kind of my personal favorite Agatha Christie, not my top ranked, but my personal favorite. So that is a strong recommendation, as many of you know. I do think that Murder in Mesopotamia, which of course is, that is the book that Amy Leatherin is narrating. That is the one that is most associated with her. It is an extremely flawed book, especially in its solution. But up until the point of its solution, it really reads as one of the crown jewels of Christie. And a lot of that is down to the voice of Amy Leatherin. And part of the reason I love her as much as I do is that she is a rarity in Christie because she is a female first-person narrator. Christie only did that 0.5 times other than in Murder in Mesopotamia when she had Anne Bedingfeld, who was narrating half, roughly, of The Man in the Brown Suit. Otherwise, when she has first-person narrators, I'm speaking about the novels, they are men. And she inhabits Amy Leatherin just brilliantly because I think that, similar to Miss Marple, Amy Leatherin is one of these people who is very much as she appears to be. But what she appears to be is someone that I think many people would take for granted and dismiss. And yet those are the very same qualities that make her good at the job that she is doing and the role that she is providing in this novel. So earlier in the episode when Claire mentioned, that we don't really have any sidekick nurses, this, of course, is, I think, the one example that I would use to push back on that, because I think Amy Leatherin really does function as the first-person sidekick narrator, a la Hastings, a la Watson. And what I really love is that she even calls this out directly in the novel. Here is what she says. She says that she comes to see herself as the assistant in this story to Monsieur Poirot, who takes on the doctor or surgeon role. And this is a quote from the text where they are already heavy into the investigation. I got the feeling, you see, by this time, that Monsieur Poirot and I were the doctor and nurse in charge of a case. At least, it was more like an operation, and he was the surgeon. Perhaps I oughtn't to say so, but in a queer way, I was beginning to enjoy myself. I was getting to feel that it was my job to help him, as you might say, to have the forceps and the swabs and all handy just when he wanted them. And that is one of my favorite analogies to the dual investigative process of a detective and sidekick that anyone makes in all of Christie. And it's so very Amy Leatherin because she's a pretty simple soul, actually. She's a neat and tidy nurse who doesn't like dirt and who whips her patients into shape, and she dotes on babies, and she thinks that Sheila Riley, the daughter of Dr. Riley, is a little minx, and she doesn't very much like her, and she has her own little personal foibles and prejudices, and yet she's an excellent nurse who takes a lot of pride in her job, and because of that, Poirot recognizes that she is useful from the get-go because he has to, because she's the narrator of the story, so she has to be included in all of the key scenes. But he really does rely on her observational prowess and also the fact that she has a neat and orderly mind, and this also serves her when she is writing this account, which Dr. Riley requests of her, and he says, treat it like notes that you would write up. And, we can see that she just takes all of her duties really, really seriously and is just a lovely and I think really convincing character. And she makes the reading of that story a sheer delight. Like I'm sad that we only have one novel that's narrated by Amy Leatherin, and I feel the same way about Leonard Clement and The Murder at the Vicarage. I could read 10 stories that are narrated by Amy Leatherin. So just can't have enough good things to say about her in Murder in Mesopotamia. And I just want to quickly talk about Amy Leatherin in Passenger to Frankfurt, because this is very interesting, and we do have to deal with this since we are trying to be thorough here in our treatment of the nurses of Agatha Christie. I think the fact that we have a character named Amy Leatherin who is working as more of a quasi-nurse / social companion to the elderly Lady Matilda Cleckheaton in this book, I think that this is evidence of just how much Christie loved Amy Leatherin from Murder in Mesopotamia. I think as she was getting on in years and she was writing these stories and she was looking back more often, perhaps even on her works, she was reminded of Amy Leatherin and said, sure, let's throw her into this text. But to be honest, I don't recognize the Amy Leatherin of Murder in Mesopotamia in Passenger to Frankfurt. And it's not just the fact that she doesn't seem to have aged in many decades, a la Dr. Stillingfleet, from The Dream to Third Girl. That would be fine. But here is how Amy Leatherin is described in Passenger to Frankfurt. Amy, Lady Matilda thought suddenly, would look exactly like a sheep when she was 10 years older. A nice, faithful, kindly sheep. At the moment, Lady Matilda was glad to think, she looked still like a very agreeable, plump lamb with nice curls of hair, thoughtful and kindly eyes, and able to give kindly baas rather than to bleat. Fair enough, but this is the description that we get of Amy Leatherin in Murder in Mesopotamia. So this is what we get in the first chapter of the book, which Dr. Riley is actually writing, and he's writing of Dr. Leidner's first glimpse of Nurse Leatherin. Here's that description. A woman of 35, of erect, confident bearing, a good-humored face with slightly prominent blue eyes and glossy brown hair, cheerful, robust, shrewd, and matter of fact. That does not sound like the same person who appears in Passenger to Frankfurt under the name of Amy Leatherin. So it's a little bit of a continuity issue, but these issues come up from time to time in Christie. And I will say that the later Amy Leatherin from Passenger to Frankfurt is efficient and practical and useful. She fetches atlases and magnifying glasses and whatnot. She tries to ensure that Lady Matilda doesn't embarrass herself by dressing too shabbily when going out to a party. I'm trying to think up a little conspiracy theory where Amy Leatherin from Murder in Mesopotamia had a granddaughter who was just so enthralled by her grandmama that she decided to take her first and last name somehow. And she's just, like a descendant. But the only other thing I want to say about Amy Leatherin before I shut up and let Claire talk a little bit about her is that here is also, I think, our one example who does not fall within the younger nurse category or the middle to older aged nurse category that Claire was talking about at the beginning of the episode. We're told in that initial description that Amy Leatherin in Murder in Mesopotamia is 35, and that, I think she has qualities of both categories. She's robust and cheerful. She has good humor, but she's also shrewd. And as we see, in her treatment of her patient, Louise Leidner, she has no problem whipping Louise Leidner into shape. And, she tells her, stop this nonsense when Louise Leidner starts getting hysterical, and she wets her wrists and temples, and she's very efficient, I think, in the way of those older, shrewder sort of nurses. So she's really the full package. I just absolutely adore her. And Claire, I so apologize for how long I've been monologuing about Amy Leatherin, but please weigh in now on our...
Oh, no, please don't apologize, Ken. We're actually listening to you. I think you've totally convinced me. She really is a sidekick. I'd actually forgotten about some of those really great quotes about her being the nurse to Poirot's doctor, as it were. So, I think she's great. I think she's the ultimate calm, practical, methodical nurse. I think it is really interesting that she's not the typical young type and the typical older type that we see in Christie, especially as we've ranked her as number one. So it's almost like she's exceptional and she's kind of out there on her own, which I think is interesting. And again, our only series-long nurse character. So again, I think, she's great. She really is so worthy of getting her number one gold ranking position on the top 10. I think, like you say, not enough good things we can say about her.
Yeah, I think that's such a good way of putting it. She is exceptional within the canon because there's no one quite like her. Yeah, she's more than earned her top spot. 3 cheers for Nurse Leatherin. All right, well, let's talk some honorable mentions. And I'd love for you to start us off because we've mentioned this nurse a couple of times already. And I just want to give her due as a nurse within the canon.
So our first honourable mention is Tuppence Beresford, although she was, of course, Tuppence Cowley when she was nursing in the First World War. And we learn in The Secret Adversary a lot about what she did. And we learn that once the war is over and she's unemployed, she really misses the nursing and the sense of purpose that it gave her. And there's an absolutely brilliant opening to this book where she describes to Tommy what kind of duty she had to do. And she talks about how mundane working in a hospital was, how she had to do things like washing up, peeling potatoes. But it gets a lot more humorous when she describes how at month 8, she gets a slight check in her career as Sister Bond ate Sister Westhaven's egg, resulting in a grand row that Tuppence was blamed for, as inattention in such important matters cannot be too highly censored. So she's demoted to mop and pail again. So we really get this great understanding of how a lot of the AD nurses really started with basic cleaning tasks. And it was a long time. I think what Tuppence is describing here is basically that first 12 months. And it's really at the end of that 12 months that they're promoted to actually doing real nursing care. And certainly what was seen as better than just the cleaning was then actually cleaning for the sisters or the other nursing staff. So you really do get a sense that it is hard work. It's not really nursing work. However, she really misses that. And then throughout the other Tommy and Tuppence books, that nursing background really stays with Tuppence. We see that she's never really shocked or scared by blood or illness or death. She's quite a tough character, and I think this is really because of her nursing background. And in N or M, she is unhappy at being deemed too old to go back into nursing, which she really wants to do now that the Second World War is here. And she's got 3 whole years of experience of nursing in World War I, but she's deemed as too old, which she finds very frustrating. As we've already mentioned in By the Pricking of My Thumbs, she knows that something is not right about that nursing home, and that, again, is partly due to her nursing background. And in Poston of Fate, we see Tuppence using her medical knowledge to identify the significance of an old message about Mary Jordan having been poisoned. So I think, much like Christie, that nursing background never really leaves Tuppence. It really makes her part of who she is. So definitely had to give her an honourable mention.
She has very much deserved that honorable mention. I think it's true. It's always there. It's always there in the background. And I think that was probably Christie's personal experience, that, you know, her nursing experience was just something she drew on constantly. So I love that. All right, I'm going to take on our second honorable mention. I am thrilled to report that Miss Marple, believe it or not, oh yes, listeners, Miss Marple has done a little nursing herself. And this actually comes up in The Blue Geranium, which really is, you know, I think The Blue Geranium as a short story is sort of like the MVP of our episode, because there's just so much nursing stuff that happens in that story. You know, we get the reference to a district nurse when she's chatting with Dr. Lloyd. We obviously have a nurse murderer. We have a second nurse who I believe we'll get to a little later on this list, in addition to our nurse murderer. And then Miss Marple draws on her knowledge of nursing when she solves this story, which is the first within the second batch of the 13 problems. So it's, you know, the second of the dozen, and then we have that odd little 13th one that gets tacked on. So we're doing a little bit of establishing again in this story. And I just want to read out the portion of the story in which we find out that she did some nursing work, because it's legitimately funny. "Nurses always have litmus paper, don't they?" said Miss Marple. For testing. Not a very pleasant subject. We won't dwell on it. I have done a little nursing myself. She grew delicately pink. I mean, I believe what that's a reference to is that you can do a urine analysis with litmus paper, right? Where if you apply urine to it, you can test the pH of the urine, and that can give an indication of urinary tract infections, kidney issues, etc. So litmus paper is just something that many nurses will have on hand, which is why the evil nurse Coupling has the litmus paper, which she uses on the wallpaper. And I love that Miss Marple knows about that. You know, I think there is no question that Miss Marple would not have fainted in the operating theater. I think she would have relished the blood and the gore. I joke, but you know, that was for Catherine. Dark Marple definitely would have been a formidable nurse. But I know that you also had some thoughts about Miss Marple as a nurse, Claire.
Yes, I thought it was just so interesting when we learn that she's a nurse, because again, I'd totally forgotten that until recently revisiting the short story. So she really, you know, must have been nursing in the Victorian era, which meant that she could have really been doing anything, because of course it wasn't clearly defined at that time. And I think something that I noticed in They Do It With Mirrors is when Miss Marple and Ruth Van Rydock are reminiscing about their younger days, Ruth says that Miss Marple had an idealistic notion that she would nurse lepers while Ruth would become a nun. And then later in Elephants Can Remember, Ariadne Oliver actually says a very similar thing. She says that when she was young, she wanted to be a nun and then she wanted to be a hospital nurse. So I just thought, again, the similarities there, even though it's not the same character, was just really interesting. And maybe it highlights how few career options were available to educated women at that time. I've always heard that the three options were nursing, teaching, and secretarial work. But I guess we can add being a nun to that equation as well.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's talk about Nurse O'Brien from Sad Cypress, who did come up while we were talking about Nurse Hopkins, because, you know, this is a character who is also quite necessary to that story because we gain insight into our murderer, Nurse Hopkins, through her presence. So I know that you had a particular appreciation for Nurse O'Brien, Claire.
Yes, I just really loved it when Dr. Lord just randomly asks Nurse O'Brien to go and get some boiling water after Laura Wellman has passed away. And it's never explained why he needed that boiling water, particularly as his patient is now deceased. But Christie writes, Nurse O'Brien was surprised and mystified, but true to the spirit of hospital training, hers not to reason why. If a doctor had told her to go and get the skin of an alligator, she would have murmured automatically, yes, doctor, and glided obediently from the room to tackle the problem. So I just thought that was such a great way of summing up nurses and that hierarchy at that time.
That's great. So I will take the next two, actually, because they are both traveling medical companion characters, and they both are from Death on the Nile, even though they are two different deaths on the Nile. The first is the one from the Parker Pine Investigates collection, and she is Elsie McNaughton, who's a good red herring nurse, actually, within this, you know, rather slight for Christie short story. We can suspect her at one point, but she is a competent and professional nurse, and very much is filling that role of providing her nursing services to an older, somewhat cantankerous woman so that she's straddling the line between social and medical. And then much more famously, in the much more famous Death on the Nile featuring Monsieur Poirot, we have Miss Bowers, who is the traveling medical companion with Miss Van Schuyler. And this to me is really interesting. And for a second, I actually wanted to put Miss Bowers within our top dozen nurses. And there's an argument to be made that we should have, A, because she's within Death on the Nile, and B, by virtue of the fact that I think she's the rare traveling medical companion who is providing services that are not only as to physical needs of Miss Van Schuyler, who is definitely older, but also psychological, we could say, because we learn that Miss Van Schuyler is a kleptomaniac and that Miss Bowers is really there to make sure that Miss Van Schuyler stays in line. And when she's first introduced, Miss Bowers' ability to keep a close watch on Miss Van Schuyler is highlighted. It's Mrs. Robson, who is a relation of Miss Van Schuyler's, who says, "I do hope there won't be any trouble." She had lowered her voice. Miss Bowers, however, replied in her usual tone, "Oh, no, Mrs. Robson. I shall take good care of that. I keep a very sharp lookout always." So, you know, just I think a great traveling medical companion character. And then I, of course, have to give a shout out to Maggie Smith's turn as Bowers. They sort of drop the miss in the Peter Ustinov adaptation. And I'll be honest, I think that this adaptation is oddly responsible for the misremembering of the Miss Bowers character in the text, because there's not much that is very nurse-like about Bowers in the Ustinov adaptation as played by Maggie Smith, even though I suppose she is still straddling that line between a social and medical companion, but she has the more masculine clothing and they have that sort of comedic interaction with each other. So I think sometimes Maggie Smith's interpretation can overwhelm the textual Miss Bowers. And I just also then have to mention the Marie Van Schuyler. I can't remember if she's Miss or Mrs. in this one. And the Bowers character that we get in the Kenneth Branagh 2022 adaptation of Death on the Nile, where they're played by French and Saunders, or Saunders in French, I guess I should say. It's Jennifer Saunders, who is Marie Van Schuyler, and Dawn French, who is Bowers. Like one of the best comedic duos in Britain today. And yet the ultimate trick is that there's nothing comedic about them because they are actually a lesbian couple very much in love, and we're never sort of like laughing at their expense or anything. And I guess it's sort of played as a twist because we're thinking of Bette Davis and Maggie Smith in the Peter Ustinov movie, but I just remember being extremely annoyed by that because it felt like a missed opportunity. And like, why would you cast French and Saunders and not make them funny? But I am officially now verging onto tangent territory in hour 3 of our episode, so I will shut up. Claire, why don't you move on to our next couple of honorable mentions?
The next couple are Nurse Mabel Palmer from The Big Four. So this is the nurse who lures Poirot to the house of the Templetons. Poirot does actually check out her credentials, and they do check out. So it's never really clear whether she is an agent of the Big Four or not. It's possible those credentials could have been fake, maybe not. So again, we don't really know, is she a real nurse or one of our fake nurses? But again, she has quite a small role in the Big Four, but just worth a mention there. And then we have Nadine Boynton from Appointment with Death. So before marrying Lennox Boynton, Nadine actually worked in a hospital where she was training to be a nurse. So she's a useful nurse character in Appointment with Death, simply because it explains why a hypodermic syringe is present, and it gives her her character a background. So again, just thought it was worth a brief mention here.
Absolutely. And then, Claire, why don't you take our next entry as well? Because this discovery was all yours.
Oh, okay. So the next one is Nurse Ellerton in A Murder is Announced. This is a character we never actually meet, but when Miss Marple is doing one of her well-known recalling of village life parallels, she recalls Nurse Ellerton, who overdosed 2 patients with morphia. And they were elderly. One had cancer, and the nurse thought that they would die soon anyway. So when Miss Marple is asked if they were mercy killings, she replies that no, Nurse Ellerton liked money and persuaded her patients to sign their money over to her. So I thought that was kind of interesting because of the village life parallel. I then realized later on that Nurse Ellerton was possibly inspired by a true crime case in the 1930s in England. And this is interesting because it's actually referenced in After the Funeral. And in After the Funeral, the nurse is referred to as Nurse Waddingham. This could be a misspelling because the true crime real life case was actually Nurse Waddington. And she was the matron of a nursing home. Again, a kind of a query here about whether she really was a matron and really was a qualified nurse, or was she just somebody who called herself a matron and had set up her own home as a nursing home. She basically manipulated 2 patients to sign over their savings to her, and then she murdered them with an overdose of morphine. So very much the same thing as our fictional Nurse Ellerton in A Murder is Announced. So I just thought that was so fascinating to potentially based on a true crime story and have it referenced in another book and then have a fictional character in a different book. So that was fascinating.
You know that I love to talk about how there are so many true crime cases that Christie references, but except for the big ones, I think we so often miss those references. So I love that you're pulling out one having to do with a murderous nurse. That's really, really interesting. All right, I'm going to take our last batch of honorable mentions before we get down to an even lower, a third tier category of just like a couple more nurses who we kind of want to mention so that you don't think we forgot them. So I'm going to move pretty quickly through all of these. First up is Nurse Lauriston from The Edge, one of Agatha Christie's lesser-known short stories. She is a nurse with some unorthodox practices. And you know what? I'm going to leave it at that because, believe it or not, we haven't yet covered The Edge on this podcast. That is a gaping hole I'm going to fill in a near future episode. So we'll learn a whole lot more about Nurse Lauriston together. Next, we have a reference in The Mysterious Affair at Styles to Captain Hastings' cousin. He describes her as being terrified of sisters, to which Cynthia Murdoch replies, "I don't wonder. Sisters are, you know. They simply are. You've no idea. But I'm not a nurse, thank heaven. I work in the dispensary." That is practically Agatha Christie autofiction right there. Love it. Next up, Claire made mention very briefly at the top of the episode to the unnamed redheaded nurse who appears at the beginning of Towards Zero. This is one of our many redheaded nurses in the works of Agatha Christie. And even though she doesn't have a name, she's worth another mention because she really sets the tone for the novel, telling the recovering Angus McWhirter that his life still has purpose and he may go on to accomplish something, which he definitely does. Let's also give some love to Batani from The Man in the Brown Suit. I mentioned Batani when we were talking about the lack of doctors in The Man in the Brown Suit and how Anne is just really rude about Batani, who is this indigenous woman who helps nurse her back to health after she has her big fall. She just doesn't really get any credit for being a good nurse, so I wanted to mention her here. And then finally, we have Katrina Rieger, who is this interesting character from the Poirot short story, How Does Your Garden Grow? This is another companion nurse character, so she's straddling the line between companion and nurse. But I think she's worth mentioning because she's a very successful red herring nurse character. The fact that she gave her employer, Miss Barrowby, her medications is the main reason that she's under suspicion, because it turns out that she is actually going to gain monetarily from her employer's death, that she is going to inherit all of her money, and her employer has died by way of strychnine. So, of course, we would suspect the companion nurse. But crucially, since the nurse occupies this amorphous middle zone within a household, we learn that the nurse actually never ate with the family, but she ate separately since she was technically a member of the help. And this was how the true murderers, who were the niece and the husband of the niece of Miss Barrowby, the murdered woman, this is how they actually were able to pull off their murderous plot, because they added some oysters, which they had poisoned with strychnine, to the meal at the point at which Katrina wasn't there and was none the wiser. And of course, they put those oyster shells into the garden, and Poirot, because he's brilliant, was able to figure it all out. And in this way, poor Katrina was able to collect that money that she clearly earned by being an honest and reputable nurse. So just a nice little short story version of a red herring nurse there, which I think was very successful. Okay, so before we move on to our third tier nurses, I will bet that there are at least a few of you listeners out there who are very worried that Claire and I forgot a major nurse character, or at least a nurse character from a major book. That would be Greta Olson, who did not quite make it onto our honorable mention list because we were more than a little confused about her. Just exactly what kind of a nurse is Greta Olson meant to be? Given that she is said to be the nurse to the child, Daisy Armstrong, one might assume that she is a nursemaid and not a medical nurse, so not to be covered in this episode. But then we have Suzanne in Murder on the Orient Express, the poor nursemaid who dies by suicide when she falls under suspicion for the kidnapping and murder of poor Daisy Armstrong. And Daisy is an only child, so there wouldn't be two nursemaids, right? Greta Olson is described as a family nurse at one point in the novel, but what the heck is a family nurse? When questioned about her occupation, she does confirm that she is a trained nurse and that she was a matron at a missionary school near Istanbul. So she does indeed seem to be a trained medical nurse. And fascinatingly, Claire found via some Googling that wealthy families in New Jersey at the time of the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, which is essentially the same time that Christie wrote this book based on that kidnapping, often had a full nursery staff sort of a structure, and that having both a qualified medical nurse to attend to the health and medical needs of the children, as well as a nursery maid to do the more menial tasks, was a sign of wealth and status. This structure was starting to change in the 1930s, especially due to the Depression, and also the fact that the childcare model was just changing in general. The real Lindbergh family did not have both a medical nurse and a nursemaid, but maybe Christie included Greta Olson, the hospital-trained nurse, to emphasize that the Armstrong family were very, very wealthy. We know that she liked to make her American characters wealthy, and she was making a point in this novel that a wealthy American household would draw together as many different people as possible. That actually is a clue that helps Poirot figure out what is going on that train. So I suppose that might explain why we have this odd situation of a medical nurse and a nursery maid in one household. Two further points on Greta that are worth mentioning. This first one is all Claire, who realized that Greta Olson and Jennifer Fortescue are a perfect contrast in that it's Jennifer's nurse training that keeps her from participating in a revenge murder, right? But then I think this shows both Greta's devotion to Daisy and just the atrocity of kidnapping and murdering a child, an act so awful that it creates a motive powerful enough to overcome even Greta Olsen's training. And my last point is that this is the only character in all of Agatha Christie's oeuvre to have garnered the actor playing her an Academy Award. Ingrid Bergman won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress playing Greta Olsen in that fabulous 1974 adaptation of Murder on the Orient Express. The only other Oscar, by the way, to have been awarded to a Christie film was Best Costume Design for 1978's Death on the Nile. Billy Wilder's Witness for the Prosecution was nominated 6 times, but won nothing, which is just ridiculous. So, for all of the above reasons, even though we decided not to place Greta Olsen within our top dozen, controversial decision, I know, or even on our honorable mention list, we wanted to take a moment to recognize her. Now, let's close out with some minor nurse characters who are just literally worth a mention here. I had made reference to Nurse Carstairs, who is the predecessor to Nurse Copling in The Blue Geranium and is also used for purposes of obfuscation. Nurse Copling pretends that Nurse Carstairs is the one who recommended this fortune teller who, sort of seeds all of this superstition, but this is all actually down to Nurse Copling. So, Nurse Copling, by the way, is older, whereas Nurse Carstairs is younger. So going by the guidelines that you laid out for us, Claire, at the beginning of the episode, we should know from the start that Nurse Carstairs has to be innocent and Nurse Copling has to be guilty. It's the bad nurse from the VAD and the good nurse from the VAD. Who are some other nurses that we just want to mention really quick?
We've got Elspeth Johnson, who is the matron at Meadowbank School in Cat Among the Pigeons, and her life really is the school. In the Sitterford mystery, we have Nurse Davis, who is Mr. Gardner's nurse. We have Janet St. Vincent, who was Janet Smith, a friend of Tuppence's from the Partners in Crime Pot of Tea short story. And then we have Deirdre Henderson from Mrs. McGinty's Dead. She's the daughter of Edith and stepdaughter of Roger Weatherby, and she was a VAD and chauffeur during the First World War. And then finally, we have Mrs. Clapperton from Problem at Sea, who ran a hospital during the First World War.
Yes. And also Nurse Capstick. I skipped over her when I started with Nurse Carstairs, but Nurse Capstick from the ABC Murders, who cares for Lady Charlotte Clark, the wife of Sir Carmichael Clark, could never forget Nurse Capstick. And then in addition to those two male nurse characters who we already mentioned, we do have a couple of other non-doctor male medical characters who I just think are interesting enough to give a shout out to. Rudy Shares in A Murder Is Announced. He is one of our murder victims. He worked as an orderly in a clinic in Switzerland, and that's why he was murdered, because of what he knew. So that's an interesting one. And then also Hood in Peril at End House, who receives the poisoned box of chocolates and leaves them on a table for a nurse to take to Nick Buckley. This is just a really important but minor part of that story because we have crucial misdirection here in that we are convinced that Nick couldn't have poisoned herself given, what is happening with that box of chocolates, but she in fact did. And I think the fact that, we have Hood and this nurse and all of these characters within this nursing home, it makes us think that Nick just couldn't be as responsible for everything as she is. So that is not to say that we have covered every single nurse within the canon, but I think we have once again done ourselves proud. But I do encourage all of you out there to email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. Let us know if you think there's anyone we forgot or someone who you think we didn't talk about enough. But I believe we are going to end in the same way that we did our Doctors of Agatha Christie episode, which is for each of us to ask the other. And I'll start by asking you, Claire, if you had to be medically treated by one of the nurses from the Christie canon, who would it be?
It would absolutely be Amy Leveron, our number one nurse. She's kind, she's reliable, she's trustworthy, and as well as being a great nurse, she also has the ability to recount or write a murder mystery. So that could be really interesting as well. I have to say, I would also be happy to be nursed by Tuppence, as I think she's a lot of fun. I do think the downside, though, is if she got distracted by the possibility of an adventure, I don't think I'd see her again as a patient. And I think at some point, she would probably require nursing care and end up being a patient because she does like to get herself kidnapped, tied up, coshed on the head, poisoned, etc. So she might not be the most reliable, but I do think she'd be fun. What about you, Kemper? Who would it be for you?
Yeah, Tuppence is definitely a nurse in need of nursing for sure. That is a good point. It's Amy Leatherin. There's just no question. I mean, she is an excellent nurse. And as I believe I proved, I just love her to pieces. You know, she'll bathe my temples. She'll ward off would-be stalkers. She won't be afraid to slap me, you know, knock some sense into me if I'm being hysterical. Maybe not quite the standard of medical care that she would practice today. I think she would be top-notch in whatever time she was working. But for 1936, that was top-notch care. I also think that if I were lucky enough to be ministered to by a young litmus paper toting Miss Marple, that I would be in very good hands because Miss Marple can do anything, and I feel like she would probably instruct me to take some of her delicious homemade liqueurs, maybe a cherry brandy or a damson gin or what have you. So if Miss Marple is doing the dispensing, I would take my medicine happily.
As you should. Yes. I think that would be great.
As I should. Well, Claire, I mean, here's the funny thing, listeners. When Claire first contacted me and she was like, oh, you know, we should do a doctor's episode and maybe a nurse's too. At first we thought we'd do them together. And then I knew already, I was like, oh, no. This is definitely 2 episodes worth of material. And we thought, well, we'll definitely have enough to do a really long doctor's episode of Agatha Christie, but will we have enough to do the nurses? I guess so. And here we are. Many hours later, you know, I think we ended up having even more to say about the nurses and the doctors. And fair enough, because I think these nurses are occupying such a fascinating position within so many of these stories and are just such interesting characters. And again, Claire, I just cannot thank you enough for all the work that you have put into these episodes and for just being in dialogue with me about these characters. It has just been a delight from beginning to end.
Oh, thank you so much, Kemper. I have absolutely loved every minute of it. And I would really encourage any listeners out there that want to do research on any kind of theme. It's just such a fun thing to do. And it does make you look at the novels and the short stories in a totally different way. And once you get stuck into it, it's just amazing how much you learn and how much comes out of it. So it's been an absolute blast. Thank you so much, Kemper, for having me here.
Well, you heard it here first, listeners. If you want to do a ton of work and do one of these themed episodes with me, that's a pretty ringing endorsement. So I really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Claire.
Thank you.
Well, that was The Nurses of Agatha Christie. Happy Nurses Week. Happy Nurses Day. Thank you to all those nurses out there who might be listening. And of course, thank you again to Claire Wells, who just brought such a wealth of research and enthusiasm to these 2 episodes on the Doctors and Nurses of Agatha Christie. I had such a great time with her. And I do hope that other listeners reach out to me with other topics that they would like to cover with me on the podcast. I want to do this more, so please don't be a stranger. Email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. But in the meantime, I will continue to do my thing. And for my next episode, I am going to be interviewing an author. Her name is Amy Littlefield, and she wrote a book titled Killers of Roe, My Investigation into the Mysterious Death of Abortion Rights. Yes, there is an Agatha Christie angle to this book, a big one, actually. All will be explained on my next episode. I'm looking forward to bringing that conversation to you. I recently put out a Patreon episode all about Behind the Screen, one of those curious communally written mystery stories that Agatha Christie participated in the 1930s. This one is rarely talked about, but it does feature a chapter written by Agatha Christie. And in the same episode, I also considered the Scream franchise, yes, the horror franchise of Scream movies, as a whodunit series. So if that intrigues you, head on over to Patreon. There's a link in the show notes. I am also gearing up for my book tour for Sweet Spot, the third book in my Ghostwriter Mysteries series. I have included a link to the news and events page of my website, which includes all sorts of tour dates. I'm going to be doing an event here in Los Angeles on the day the book comes out at Diesel, more on the west side in the Brentwood Country Mart. I'll be in a few different places in New England in July. I'm going to be more in the upper Midwest in August. I will be in Chicago, Madison, and Milwaukee in Wisconsin, also in Minneapolis, and I have more dates that will be set in Texas and Arizona, and I'm hopeful that we will perhaps have some dates in Colorado and or Utah as well, so watch that space. And I'll let you know as we inch closer to those tour dates. You can also still buy tickets to the Agatha Christie Festival in September. I am doing 2 different events. I've included a link to the festival and to my 2 events in the show notes. I've also included a link to the podcast's Instagram account and a general link to my author website, www.kemperdonovan.com. Please take a moment to rate the podcast, review the podcast, help others find the podcast. It's very, very meaningful, so thank you in advance, and I will see you next time. Bye.
If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Because as your life changes and your body changes, Sleep Number mattresses adapt and shift to give you personalized comfort night after night. And now everything's on sale during our Memorial Day event. Save up to $1,200 on mattresses for a limited time. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number, to a good life sleep.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.